Thank you. Without objection, Representative Magaziner will be waived on the committee for the purpose of asking question at today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. And I want to remind our witnesses and the members before we enter into the question and answer phase that we have a 5-minute clock, and we try to adhere to that 5-minute time frame. If someone asks a question and the 5 minutes expires, we'll give you an opportunity to answer it, but please be mindful. We have a lot of questioners, and we want to get through this also. We will begin questioning. Recognize the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Part of the focus of our hearing today is based upon a recent letter signed by 21 attorneys general highlighting how organizations, including asset managers and proxy advisors, could be violating state and federal law to channel funds for political objectives in the category of ESG, environmental, social, and government practices. One of our witnesses exclaimed that we're asking him to stop doing his job. We're not asking you to stop doing your job, good sir. We just expect to review whether or not some of your colleagues are violating the law in the course of doing their job. From the second paragraph of that letter, which was signed, by the way, again, Mr. Chairman, by 21 attorney generals, the second signature on that letter, I'd like to submit for the record the opening statement of my own attorney general, my colleague and friend, Attorney General Jeff Landry, former congressman here in this body, was not able to attend the hearing today, but I'd like to submit his statement for the record, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. From the second paragraph of the letter signed by so many of our attorneys general addressing asset managers, said these companies are some of the largest asset managers in the United States. It's important for the American people watching to grasp this. Collectively controlling trillions of dollars of investments. Many individuals and organizations count on these asset managers to provide sound investment products and advice. The top 3 asset managers alone cast about a quarter of the votes for the S&P 500 company shareholder meetings. They are therefore not only bound to follow the general laws discussed, but also have extensive responsibilities under both federal and state laws governing securities. Broadly, those laws require asset managers to act as a fiduciary and in the best interest of clients, exercising due care and loyalty. Simply put, asset managers are not the same as political or social activists and should not allow vast savings entrusted to be commandeered by activists like ESG activist organizations. So, Attorney General Reyes, I'd like to address the question to you, sir, regarding, to clarify for America, what legal requirements must asset managers who act as fiduciaries adhere to when investing on behalf of a client? And how do these requirements impact investment decision makings? And I'm going to ask you to address not only the letter of the law, but the spirit of the law that we're inquiring about today.
Thank you for the question, Congressman. I'll try to be brief, and it's very simple. Their duty is a fiduciary duty. Under laws like ERISA, it is the highest of all duties that one can owe to another in a fiduciary relationship. And that fiduciary duty requires them investing assets on behalf of others to maximize shareholder value, to maximize return back to the shareholder. It's as simple as that. That has been the rule, the prime directive, if you will, for generations, and it served our market and it served our nation well.
how would you assess, for the committee and for Americans viewing this hearing, how would you assess, Attorney General Reyes, the performance of ESG investment versus traditional investment?
I believe there are a number of studies that show that ESG funds have globally underperformed. So my data contradicts the data that we saw earlier from the ranking member. If I recall, and there are multiple studies, but I'll point to one, over the past 5 years, global ESG funds have underperformed the broader markets by more than 250 basis points per year, an average 6.3% return compared with an 8.9% return. So in other words, an investor who put $10,000 into an average global ESG fund in 2017 would have about $13,500 today, compared with $15,250 investment in the broader market. So that's one example from one study or some market research that demonstrates that ESG is not necessarily a good bet, and that asset managers should, again, be investing in the best interests of their beneficiaries or their shareholders, not for a prescribed outcome that's dictated by these horizontal agreements and pushed and pressured by organizations like NZAM and Climate Action 100.
I thank General Reyes for his clarification there. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Frerichs, you said that ESG is data. And some people call it ESG, some people call it responsible investing, some people just call it exercise of fiduciary obligations. But in any event, you're saying what's under attack is data. How could more data hurt?
More data cannot hurt. More data is what we need as investors to make good decisions. I liken this to these attacks of states that would prescribe asset managers or proxy advisors providing this data for us, is to making us pick a fantasy football team without knowing the players' weights, their injury status, their track record. You can't make good decisions without useful, pertinent information. And that's what ESG is.
Go into a time machine for a second, if you could. How does your job differ from someone who was the treasurer of Illinois 50 years ago? I mean, back in those days, it seemed like it'd be simple if you were trying to do the valuation for an auto company. How many autos are pumped out every year, and number of man hours that go into, and so on. How is the valuation of companies different today in 2023 than it was 50 years ago?
The nature of value in the S&P 500 has changed dramatically over the last 50 years. If you look back in the early 1970s, it was probably somewhere between 75 to 80% of the total value of the S&P 500 was intangible assets. Things like cars, things like paper, things like pencils. And you could do an analysis, financial analysis, how many acres of forest you have under contract, and you could see how many cars and pencils you could produce, and you could reach a value. Today, the S&P 500 has about 80% of the value in things like brands, intellectual property. And those things are subject to different risks than those companies 50 years ago. We are just trying to guard against those risks. A company like Google is not worth how much it is today because the number of petaflops of data they have is based on their reputation. Apple is not worth $1 trillion because of the number of iPhones they sell, but because of their reputation. And those are susceptible to social and governance risks.
Well, you know, some of the disagreement here is about facts, and I appreciate what Attorney General Reyes just said. He made the claim that the ESG informed investments do more poorly than the Standard & Poor's General. Our data is completely different from that, showing that it's been overperforming. I'd like your comments on that, but then I'd like you to comment on this. Let's say Utah sees it differently than Illinois. Is there any problem with you pursuing the investment strategy you want and Utah pursuing the investment strategy they want?
Investing is not easy. Some people want to put more work into it than others. If someone doesn't want to look at this data, that's fine. They have that freedom. Nothing in ESG prescribes that someone has to consider these sources. I would say they would be not fulfilling their fiduciary duty if they didn't, but they had that right to. And I would cite other studies like a New York study, Stern School of Business, a recent meta-study, which is a statistical analysis that combines the results of multiple academic studies. Looked at 245 individual studies on ESG and financial performance. The study found a positive relationship between ESG and financial performance for 58% of those studies. Only 8% showed a negative relationship. You can pick and choose. Any investment strategy will have quarters where it performs better than others. You can pick and choose, but over time, ESG has been a good set of data to help us make better investment
And
decisions.
you make that judgment as a financial expert who has a fiduciary duty to everybody in Illinois, right?
I have a fiduciary duty to the beneficiaries of those pension funds, the beneficiaries of those college savings funds. I don't have a fiduciary duty to the oil and gas industry.
But you've got a fiduciary duty to maximize the returns, and what you're saying is you want more information. Like somebody says, this Purdue company just got 57% in the last quarter, invest in Purdue. What about saying, well, that's all that you could do at that point? You can't look at whether or not they're trying to get people addicted to drugs because that would be too woke.
That was exactly what happened with Purdue Pharma. If you looked at their financial returns, they showed themselves to be a very profitable company. But we wanted to know more because there are risks associated with selling highly addictive drugs.
Oh, so that's a real case for you.
Real case, reputational risks, regulatory risks, litigation risk. And those litigation risks took a company that was very profitable for a long time and bankrupted it.
Okay, this is my final question. Why shouldn't Congress say, well, you know what? We're the House of Representatives, the anti-ESG people, we're in control. We're going to stop states like Illinois from looking at all the data. What's wrong with that?
Well, that is what some states are doing, and it is costing those states not insignificant amounts of money. You pointed out some of those. The state of Indiana, their pension system said it's going to cost an additional $6.7 billion to comply with their anti-ESG law. The state of Kansas, it's about $3.6 billion. The state of Kentucky, the Kentucky pension system, said if forced to comply with their state's anti-ESG law, they would not be following their fiduciary.
They would rather be broke than woke. I yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair recognizes Mr. Gosar of Arizona for 5 minutes.
Attorney General Reyes, you just heard the comment about science. This is about data. Can you dispute that?
Thank you. A couple of things I want to comment on. I think my colleague mentioned that more data is all good, right? And that more data cannot hurt. I disagree with that because I think there can be bad data if it distracts or in some cases even distorts the import and the focus of what fiduciaries should be solely laser focused on. If it's not benign data, I'll give you an example. Standard & Poor's issued ESG indicators alongside the creditworthiness for states. In a state like Utah that has a AAA credit rating, the Standard & Poor's would point out in one instance the issue of drought without taking into consideration a whole other host of mitigating factors that Utah has, anti-drought measures. By itself and without the context, Standard & Poor's all of a sudden makes it look like the most important factor is not Utah's creditworthiness over a long history, a AAA credit rating, but one particular factor of drought. And in that instance, it illustrates my point of distortion. My colleague used the fantasy football analogy, and all data is good data, I guess, in kind of a Moneyball sense. Again, I would take issue with that. And to use football as an example, if all of a sudden we started crowning the Super Bowl champion, not by who scored the most points in the game, but by who had the most green arena or who had the most environmentally friendly equipment, I think that data would be destructive. I think that's something that is not necessarily the indicator that we're looking for. And in this instance, again, I want to point out that we're contesting the process, and you can have all the data in the world, but when that data is driven to one particular outcome, and it's predetermined outcome, and then there is a cabal of players who are all pushing towards that one outcome, then the data is just window dressing to achieve that particular outcome.
It's manipulated. Would you give me that?
Yeah, I want to quote from NZAM, which is has 59 trillion AUM, assets under management. And this commitment is that it's consistent, it's ambition for all assets under management to achieve net zero emissions by 2050 or sooner. That's all of their assets. And it says this: the transition to net zero will be the biggest transformation in economic history. Our industry's ability to drive the transition to net zero is extremely powerful. Without our industry on board, the goals set out in the Paris Agreement will be difficult to meet. Again, and I could read chapter and verse of many other public statements like this. This just demonstrates the concerted effort by all of these organizations to push a particular outcome, regardless of what the data may or may not demonstrate.
I'm going to cite a quote. BlackRock's former CIO for sustainable investment even said in an article for Medium in 2021 that ESG investing, quote, provided for the opportunity for a bump in what were otherwise plummeting fees as competition had grown in recent years. So maybe if we looked at this, maybe if we went back to the Fisher investment. Fisher investment says when our clients do better, we do better, instead of having these commissions on here. Do you think that's an opportunity to get things right?
I definitely think that's an opportunity, Congressman. And let me also mention something that was said. Just because it's not mandated, I think that was a reference. This data, you're not forced to look at it. Just because it's not mandated does not make it any more legal. If it's allowed, again, it's data that distracts from a fiduciary's sole responsibility to maximize shareholder value.
I got one more thing. You brought up FERC in regards to energy. So are you aware that we were dangerously close to having a nationwide blackout earlier this year? And what did that play in that investment portfolio in regards to where we get our energy, intermittent versus baseload energy?
That's what several FERC commissioners testified to just last week in a Senate hearing, Congressman, that efforts to transition to cleaner energy is happening so fast, too fast, that it would have catastrophic effects on reliability and security of our electric grid.
We're actually outpushing our science. And you have to have dependable science that is peer-reviewed and is repeatable. So thank you very much. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes Ms. Ocasio-Cortez from New York for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Frerichs, if you had to describe your job to a layperson, how would you describe it in one or two sentences?
I'm the Chief Investment Officer. My job is to maximize returns for the state of Illinois and our beneficiaries.
And your beneficiaries are the citizens and folks who reside in the state of Illinois, correct?
To the citizens of the state, they're the participants in college savings plans and retirement savings plans and retiree pensioners.
So everyday people saving for college, saving for retirement, and who really just want to make sure they can put their dollar in a long-term investment that is stable, correct?
Most of these people put their money in and they expect not to look at the next quarter, but we look at the next quarter century.
And that's a distinction between what we see sometimes on Wall Street or in other types of short-term investment, where you really just want to look at what's going to make you money by the end of the year or in the end of a quarter, correct?
Frequently, a CEO might be motivated by a bonus trying to hit a point for the next quarterly profit report. But we want to make sure they're putting the company on a sustainable path to be profitable for the next 10 or 20 years, because that's what families saving for college and people saving for retirement care.
And in the course of your work, have you noticed that short-term profit-seeking behavior is not always consistent with long-term returns for everyday people?
Correctly. The example we used with Purdue Pharma, when they sold highly addictive drugs to Americans, they made money hand over fist. It's a great business model to sell an addictive drug to someone. Mm-hmm. But until when those people start dying off, their relatives engage in class action lawsuits that sank that company. Or you can have a railroad company that determined we can make more money by cutting staff by 30%. We can add more cars to the rail to make more money. Mm-hmm. And we don't spend time moving the cars around to distribute load. And then when that railroad has a derailment in Ohio, it costs that company real dollars. Because it costs investors, shareholders, and beneficiaries.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you bring that up, Mr. Frerichs, because I think what we're seeing here is that the other side of the aisle is making the argument here that we should just look at the balance sheets, the short-term returns, and the short-term investments in order to make long-term financial decisions. But the irony of that is that this committee right now and in the past has been charged with investigating companies that have abused the public by deliberately leaving critical information off those balance sheets. You've seen that in your work, haven't you, Mr. Frerichs?
We've all seen this. I heard it talk about bad data. There was bad data, there was false data that sunk Enron. This had nothing to do with ESG. You can look and find bad data anywhere. It's the job of an investor to sort through that data and to look through multiple lenses.
Right. We just lived through this with SBF and FTX. We just saw this 2 years ago. We went through a multi-installment investigation of DuPont's poisoning with respect to PFAS in water. Veterans communities, communities that live around military bases, airports, et cetera, dealing with reproductive cancers, testicular cancers, from information that was withheld from those balance sheets. Norfolk Southern and the train derailment in East Palestine. Those communities are struggling to access information that this company is hiding because it is not necessary to put on their balance sheets. Right now, we are investigating Abbott for baby formula and the issues that were happening with infants dying in baby formula, and that too was kept off balance sheets, but also had financial impacts on the performances of those companies. They had to take that production offline. And so the argument here is that our our investment managers in different states should not take this information into account when making investment decisions for the public. Mr. Frerichs, can you really do your job if you're just looking at short-term returns, if your job is for the long-term financial health of people saving for college and retirement?
No, as a fiduciary for families saving for college, for people saving for their retirement, they don't really care so much if a company is profitable next quarter. They care if it is profitable for the next 10, 20 years or quarter century.
And so when we talk about where this push is coming from, why now? Why is this happening?
Listen, this is happening because the nature of value in companies has changed. We still do traditional financial analysis, but we layer on another level of analysis to deal with these risks, and they are material. They may deal with human capital, they may deal with workers, they may deal with the environment, but they have real-world consequences on the bottom line of these corporations, and if we don't have access to that information, it's like investing with a blindfold on.
Thank you very much, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair recognizes Mr. Armstrong from North Dakota for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A lot of the testimony brings up many of the problems of ESG in the world of finance. Americans rely on a sophisticated financial investment system every day to plan for their future. Yet the complexities of this system allow ESG causes to take precedence over most important thing of all, which is the bottom dollar. The purpose of investments is to grow our financial security, not shrink it. As you and my colleagues have pointed out, investment in ESG funds does not bring higher returns. I would like to focus a little bit on understanding what duties proxy advisories currently have and how Congress can actually ensure economic interests legally take precedent. I got the two different sides of glasses. So, Mr. Marshall, in a few sentences, can you talk to me a little bit and define how proxy advisors and proxy voting?
Well, you've seen my colleagues reach out to the two proxy advisor firms to be very critical of the nature of how they do business. Really, what I think much of the fundamental discussion that we're having today is what is a fiduciary? And what is that fiduciary responsibility to those hard-earned Americans who have given their money to be invested? One of the things that is clear is that proxy advisors are acting outside of the directive of those particular investors, but instead are making their own independent value judgments about how they vote with regard to certain shareholder initiatives. Clearly, they are connected through various alliances to not only deal with global energy policy, but also a set of preferred societal values. And when we see various shareholder initiatives around issues that don't relate to the bottom line, don't relate to the return for those particular investors, but instead purport to be a political agenda, then they're acting outside of the scope of their responsibility and breaching their fiduciary duties.
Mr. Reyes, what is robo-voting? How does it magnify the power of proxy advisor recommendations? And should Congress consider restricting its use?
Robo-voting, automatic voting has given even more power to the proxy advisor duopoly that is ISS and Glass Lewis. That is part of what we would ask you, Congressman, to look at with regard to proxy voting. The market for proxy advisory firms, as I mentioned and General Martian mentioned, is dominated by two players, Institutional Shareholder Services, ISS, and Glass Lewis, and their combined market share is approximately 97%. So you're looking at predominant market players who influence many of the institutional advisors and asset managers for whom they provide supposedly objective advice for. A study has shown, though, that a significant number of institutional investors simply follow the voting advice of proxy voters. This is like automatic, straight ticket voting. It's common sense that proxy advisory firms should focus on providing objective advice related to maximizing value of shares in the companies that are the subject of shareholder proposals and board of director elections. Unfortunately, for these two particular advisors, they again have very public, purposeful statements about what their end goals and objectives are, including retiring coal plants, including transitioning away from fossil fuels and getting to net zero Paris 2015 goals. It's difficult to see and to imagine that they can be entirely neutral and provide objective opinions for those for whom they're serving when they have such strongly stated goals and when they start every shareholder vote. I think one estimate was they have 38% or so of the votes already locked in, and so it's very difficult to overcome their predisposed decision-making process. So those are all issues that we would like for you to take up in a further hearing with regard to proxy voting.
And Mr. Marshall, if proxy advisors are not acting in the best interests of their shareholders, what current mechanisms are in place to hold them accountable, and what should be accountable to?
One of the things that exists for AGs is under our consumer protection laws, Deceptive Trade Practices Act. I think one of the things that you've seen already is Republican attorneys general have been active on the investigative side using both our consumer protection laws as well as the antitrust laws. Multiple investigations are now pending, and we have the opportunity to be able to report back on those investigations. But as well, I think General Reyes has outlined for this committee various ways that this body can act to be able to rein in what we believe is an unlawful practice.
Well, as somebody who served in state government and the federal government, I appreciate the fact that sometimes you can move more quickly than we can. With that, I yield back.
Chair recognizes Ms. Bush from Missouri for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. St. Louis and I are here today for a timely and important hearing to defend the planet itself. The acronym ESG has been used so much today already that I'd like to remind everyone what it stands for: environmental, social, and corporate governance. The relationship between the activities of giant corporations like Microsoft, Apple, and eBay have an immeasurable impact on our society and on our environment. By now, we all know that the health of our planet is fleeting. All you have to do is step outside, feel the seasons getting shorter and the temperatures getting higher. You just have to turn on the news to see the latest natural disaster devastating communities. You just have to listen to the scientists and climate experts who are telling us point blank that it is now or never. Act today or wish you had yesterday. My hometown of St. Louis ranks among the highest across the country in rates of asthma, with rates significantly higher for Black residents than white residents. ESG principles are the bare minimum corporations can abide by to protect the communities that serve as their domestic headquarters in cities like St. Louis. The cost of doing business should not be a lifetime of pollution for small towns and cities across this country. Mr. Frerichs, Do Republican attacks on responsible investing practices actually increase the waste and mismanagement of taxpayer dollars? Yes or no?
Well,
and if so, how?
I think attacks that limit our ability to consider all factors, to have access to data, costs us, and this has been documented in other states. I think there's a misunderstanding of what proxy advising firms do. The secret right there is in the word advisory. They don't make these votes. The fiduciaries make these votes. And if a fiduciary decides to just turn it all over to someone else, that's their choice. But a good fiduciary will rely on their advice and other sources of information. We're part of several coalitions we get information from. The example I like to use is we're trying to get a good, clear picture of these corporations and their profitability over the long term. Now, you notice I wear glasses. I didn't always wear glasses, but the nature of my eyes changed over the last 30 years, and I had to take steps to see better. And when I went to go see an optometrist, they gave me a choice of 2 different lenses and said, which helps you see better? ESGs are different lenses to see. I say, okay, well, the first lens helped me see better. They'll show me 2 different ones, and eventually, after looking through several different lenses, we'll get a much clearer picture. That's what ESG data does. It helps us to have a better picture about the long-term profitability of these companies.
Thank you for that. I asked unanimous consent to submit into the record a study by Wharton Business School professor Daniel Garrett and the Federal Reserve economist Ivan Ivanov on the cost of the 2021 Texas law to limit responsible investing.
Without objection to order.
Thank you. Mr. Frerichs, could you briefly summarize the findings of this analysis for us?
Yeah, back in 2021, the state of Texas passed legislation limiting the number of firms they could use for debt issuance. And because they limited some of the largest debt issuers, there was less competition. I find this difficult that I'm the one defending the free market and the ability to have competition and access to data and for shareholders to have rights. Because I think I heard earlier someone mention that asset owners who own utility stocks are telling them what to do, as if that's a bad thing. They are owners of these companies. What they found is by limiting competition, it was costing the taxpayers of the state of Texas an additional $300 to $500 million a year.
Thank you for lending your expertise. Strong labor unions like SEIU and AFL-CIO have fought long and hard to ensure large corporations and bad actors are being held responsible for harming workers. Workers should be able to determine if their state pension funds are being invested responsibly, and ESG principles are an important first step. Now, unions are on the front lines of the fight to hold corporations accountable for their continued pollution of our communities, whether fighting for paid sick leave, livable wages, workplace safety standards, and now ESG principles. We must support strong government regulations and oversight into all activities of large corporations. The federal government has an obligation to provide resources and solutions to the climate crisis at every opportunity. Congress must ensure that with each piece of legislation we put forward, that there is some component to it that addresses the climate crisis. Thank you, and I yield back.
Chair recognizes Mr. Groffman from Wisconsin for 5 minutes.
Sure. Mr. Marshall, can you give some examples of decisions that a business would be kind of muscled into doing because of strong ESG sort of policies being implemented by, say, major pension funds?
Let me just speak to specific examples in Alabama that we have concerns about. The agriculture industry is obviously very important to us. One of the things being targeted, for example, is the farmers' use of certain types of fertilizer, how it is that they use their land itself, and the products they use to be able to produce what food goes on to the tables of families across our country. So imagine that a farmer is dealing with a member of the Net Zero Insurance Alliance who comes to that farmer and says, as part of our underwriting, we think that you need to be able to change the fertilizer that you're using. We need to be able to change your land management, or else we're not going to insure you, or we're going to make it cost prohibitive.
Could you see a situation in which, say, a bank is kind of muscled into giving out more loans to people who haven't saved money, for example?
Congressman, I think we could not only see that, but we could also see the opposite, right? We know that the Net Zero Banking Alliance, group boycotts certain industries as well as limits funding of certain projects, so that not only could we see a bank coerced to lend in ways they wouldn't previously, but also see the exact opposite, and that is to keep capital from other industries that are suddenly disfavored.
Okay, and that could be both individuals who perhaps have saved a lot of money. Maybe we don't want to give them as loans as much. We know recently we've had situations on a nationwide level in which we try to penalize people who have down payments for things. Will this perhaps affect who people hire? Like right now, there's certain disfavored groups in our society. People don't like men. People don't like people European background, that sort of thing. Could this be something where you're encouraging businesses not to hire or promote people or have on their board of directors people from unfavored groups, by people who view people as a group and not as an individual?
And also the concern about hostile workplace environments. So there's a great push by ESG proponents to have corporations take policy decisions about societal issues that are occurring today. And to the extent that you're an employee of a certain company that believe very differently than the public position that that corporation has taken as a result of being bullied by ESG proponents, then that concern would be whether or not that employee faces potential harm.
Could you give me an example?
Sure. Let's assume that a company's taken a position on the issue of abortion and said that they believe that abortion should be lawful, and yet there's fundamentally employees at that company that believe the exact opposite. Number one, they're going to be stigmatized if in fact they express their particular views, but also the concern is whether or not they're going to be denied opportunities for employment and advancement.
So, and we'll just share the wealth here, Mr. Reyes. Would that result in people being discriminated against, say, for a place on a board of directors based on political viewpoint?
Yes, and that's been stated by these organizations. They're not shy about it. They're very forthright, and they said that we will oppose and we will not support directors with certain social or environmental backgrounds.
Wow. What type of potential directors would be hated by this group?
Again, any number of them who don't support, for example, on the social side, racial discrimination audits. And I'll give you an example. There was a traveler's insurance case where a group of activist shareholders, I think it was Trillium Group, forced a shareholder vote on an audit that they demanded, which was a racial profiling audit that would require Travelers Insurance Company to potentially violate state laws in numerous states if the resolution passed.
So these are the type of people who judge people by where their great-great-grandparents came from, and they...
Yes, the irony of that is that what they were supporting actually violated anti-discrimination laws. So,
wow. And as the result, companies may have to or will feel pressured to hire people based on these, I call it ancestral criteria. Is that right?
I think that's a fair assumption, Congressman.
Okay, thank you very much.
Chair recognizes Ms. Stansberry from New Mexico for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As a social scientist who's worked on climate and sustainability issues for many years, in fact, all of my career, I actually welcome the discussion today on sustainable investing, as we know it's crucial to the future of our planet and also our economy. But obviously, that's not what this hearing is actually about. I've watched and listened today and seen as this hearing has devolved into yet another crusade in the political culture wars. But I am disappointed, Mr. Chairman, to see the use of this committee's precious time to air yet another dark money-funded, conspiracy-laden attack on American freedom. But I'm surprised to see that in this case, it's an attack on the market itself. It's amazing to me to see the kinds of attacks we've seen on American freedom by the majority. Attacks on our bodies, banning books, and now we're talking about banning the way that businesses are able to invest their own capital and public bodies. But what's especially amazing about this is how radically out of touch it is with the American public. And in fact, what's particularly insane about these bans on ESG is how out of touch they are with voters themselves, including Republican voters. And Mr. Marshall, I know you've been at the forefront of this effort, but I want to ask you, are you aware that the majority of Americans and Republican voters are actually opposed to ESG restrictions?
I can tell you that I've had multiple comments from individuals throughout my state, the 5 million almost Alabamians that I represent.
Thank you, Mr. Marshall. I'm going to direct your attention to this chart behind me. A recent poll that was released in Politico shows that the vast majority of Americans are actually opposed to restrictions on ESG. In fact, 63% of American voters overall, and over 70% of Republican voters. 70% of Republican voters are actually opposed to restrictions on ESG. But it's not just the public, it's American businesses as well. Corporations, investment firms. Mr. Marshall, are you aware that the vast majority of American businesses are also opposed to these restrictions?
Congressman, would you like me to be able to answer the first question that you asked me?
Mr. Marshall, are you aware that the vast majority of American businesses are also opposed to these restrictions?
I'm going to answer the first question that you cut me off on, which is
Thank
that
you,
as I've
Mr.
gone
Marshall.
around.
In fact, Mr. Marshall, media outlets such as Fortune, Forbes, The Washington Post have recently published articles warning American investors about these attacks on ESG and explaining why they are bad for business. Now let's talk about why they're opposed. Because profitability fundamentally depends on risk management. And Mr. Freericks, you know this because you're an asset manager. And corporate America understands the real and significant risks posed by global climate change and the other social and environmental factors that are presented as part of ESG factors and data as they're presented in investing. So my question is, why on earth is the GOP waging a war on ESG, especially when it's so completely unpopular with American corporations, the market, investors, American voters? In fact, 19 states have actually moved under extreme governors and state officials to try to ban ESG investing. We're talking about legislation, executive orders, and the very lawsuit that we're here discussing today. So my question is, why is this happening? And I think, Mr. Freericks, as you've indicated, I think in your testimony, we have to follow the money. And the reality is that this is a well-coordinated and political attack. Is that not true, Mr. Freericks?
It would seem that the fossil fuel industry is leading a charge here. We had talks about how banks are muscling companies. We have seen that. We have seen banks being muscled. Legislation in Texas is muscling banks to invest in the fossil fuel industry. Banks like to be diversified, and if they decided that they wanted to invest in renewable resources, like biofuels from Iowa, or wind turbine blades from Ohio, or solar panels being installed in Arizona, they would be punished for that. That's the real shame here.
Right. So ESG has become another boogeyman in the culture wars. This is not about fiscal responsibility. You know, it's evident we're sitting here in the very week that we're debating a potential default on the American debt ceiling. And yet the GOP is claiming that this is about fiscal responsibility and fiduciary responsibility to shareholders and the public. That is not what this is about. It is a well-funded, dark money-funded culture war attack, not only on the American economy, but on the American people. And with that, I yield back.
Yields back her time. The gentlewoman from Colorado is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our panelists for being here today. As we have heard today, there are numerous concerns related to so-called environmental, social, and governance policies being indoctrinated into accounts by woke asset managers. Today's hearing will help us better understand what Congress can do to ensure that activist stakeholders will not encourage woke corporate activism, as we have seen recently with Anheuser-Busch, Disney, and even Nike. Because as we all know around here, When you go woke, you go broke. So Attorney General Reyes, for background, could you elaborate on how asset managers can violate their duties by signing ESG pledges?
Sure, there are a number of ways. There are federal laws that could be implicated. There are state laws, including state consumer protection laws, state securities laws. There are common law contractual agreements that fiduciaries can violate. All of those different laws come into play, and one of the reasons why we've filed a lawsuit against the current administration's Department of Labor rule, weakening the fiduciary role and the duty and the responsibility of fiduciaries, is because we think it, among other things, violates major questions, doctrines, violates the APA, the Administrative Procedures Act. So all of those different ways are legal reasons why we're concerned, Congresswoman. When you hold yourselves out as being objective and you represent to your customers and your shareholders that you are being objective, then you must live up to that and not have a predisposed, predetermined end goal in mind. And I'll make one comment. My colleague and my friend, the good treasurer, mentioned proxy advisors don't vote the shares. He's right. But in many ways, they're de facto voters because many of those fiduciaries have so many thousands of different investments that they rely almost solely on the proxy advisors. And when the fiduciaries are part of the same horizontal agreements as the proxy advisors, they're all part of one and the same scheme, there really is no free market in that. And they keep talking about free market, and that's why we're here, because there's nothing free about the coercive nature of these arrangements.
And Mr. Ray, as you stated in your testimony, horizontal organizations are made up of asset managers, banks, and insurance companies. Now, I'm aware several state attorneys generals are investigating several of the net zero banking alliance groups, including JP Morgan Chase. What have those investigations found to date?
Not ready to disclose all of our findings yet, but I will say comfortably enough that we are continuing our investigations, and we hope that you would...
So, Mr. Reyes, considering the Silicon Valley Bank has collapsed and JP Morgan Chase bought the bank, has there been any indication that there's been any involvement in ESG policies that there's been while reestablishing the bank?
There may be, but I'm not willing to comment on that based on our investigations.
Thank you so much. Attorney General Marshall, as the Department of Labor under the Biden administration has considered requiring fiduciaries to consider ESG in employee retirement savings decisions, several 401ks and thrift savings plans allow managers to use their voting rights on behalf of these retirement accounts. A prime example of this is BlackRock, a primarily left-wing activist fund that uses its status as the fiduciary for several investment funds to coerce companies into introducing these ESG politics into their retirement account savings. How can Congress help ensure that these companies are not introducing ESG policies into their investment funds and instead are maximizing returns for future seniors that will need to live off of this money in these accounts?
You know, Congressman, one thing that we heard earlier from one of your colleagues is how partisan this issue is. This body has demonstrated through the Senate by attempting to overturn the new safe harbor rule under ERISA and saying that it was an improper way to consider the investments for 152 million Americans in their retirement accounts. This body can clarify clearly under ERISA the role of a fiduciary, what that means for the investment return of the individuals who have invested their accounts, and make it clear that objective criteria, not subjective ESG criteria, are used for making those decisions.
Thank you very much for that suggested solution. And Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Gentlewoman yields back her time. The gentlewoman from Ohio is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair and Ranking Member, and our witnesses. I continue to be surprised by the position of my friends on the other side. Aren't the values of free market a fundamental view of their party? Environmental, social, and governance investing is one critical tool that businesses use to make financially smart investments. This type of investing emphasizes corporate models that are both financially smart and socially good, which is truly a win-win. One aspect of corporate models that is too often overlooked is the governance and social strategies component. These strategies often center around diversity in the workforce, both at executive levels and within a particular organization and throughout the broader industry. The inclusion of people of all Black backgrounds, especially those from marginalized communities, is an essential part of America's corporate success. We thrive as a nation when every one of us is empowered and has an opportunity to succeed. Diverse voices at the table make companies stronger and their products, goods, and services more inclusive and effective. According to a 2019 McKinsey analysis, companies in the top quartile for ethnic diversity on executive teams were 36% more likely to have above average profitability. Another study showed that employees are 5.4% more likely to want to continue working at a diverse company. Clearly, businesses have a moral obligation as well as a financial incentive to make sure there is a seat at the table for historically marginalized groups, but there is still so much work to be done. So Secretary Marshall or Secretary Reyes, do you know what percent of the 5,403 board members of Fortune 500 companies are women of color?
Congressman, I do not.
No, ma'am.
The answer is 7%. Moving on, this year, the Pew Research Center published a report on Black-owned businesses in the United States which continue to face systemic structural barriers to equal opportunity, including lack of investment. I hope you all will have a chance to read it, and I ask unanimous consent that this be entered into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you so much. Secretary Marshall or Secretary Reyes, can you tell me the percentage of businesses nationwide that are Black-owned?
Congressman, I cannot.
No, ma'am.
Black-owned businesses make up only 3% of classifiable companies, despite Black Americans making up 12.4% of the U.S. population. Mr. Frericks, in your experience as Illinois' top investor, how does diversity at all levels of a company help investors meet their fiduciary responsibilities and position themselves for success?
Thank you very much for that question. The research has been fairly clear, and this is not by a left-wing organization. McKinsey is not a left-wing organization. That diversity is good for boards. I heard comments made earlier about discrimination against people from a certain ethnic background or race. There are still plenty of white men serving on corporate boards. The vast majority are. But research has shown that homogeneous boards underperform diverse boards. And it's not just the research, it's common sense. If you bring people from the same backgrounds, the same educational schools, the same cultural backgrounds together, you're going to find a lot of groupthink. A good board does well when there is discussion and back and forth and differences of opinions. And so diverse boards reduce groupthink and produce better results.
Thank you. And I would say that that answer demonstrates the need for increased diversity, both within individual corporations and throughout the broader business sector. Yet, unfortunately, punishing companies for these private corporate choices has become an element of the Republican platform from DC to Disney. While historically marginalized communities continue to face unique economic barriers, Republicans oppose corporate freedom to implement strategies for social investment, which even benefits the bottom line. In fact, the Republican platform appears to center around taking away choice, the choice to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion, the choice of a woman to have control over her own body, and the choice to read a book and live without the fear of gun violence. I urge my friends on the other side of the aisle to reconsider these misguided priorities. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back her time. The distinguished gentleman from South Carolina is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for having this hearing today. Thank you to our witnesses for your time. Under federal and state law, asset managers owe fiduciary duties to their clients. What does that mean? Well, it essentially means that they put their clients' interests first. This is a concept that is old as time. It's become increasingly clear, however, that asset managers may have violated that fiduciary duty, based on your findings, to their clients through signing radical ESG pledges. Attorney General Reyes and Attorney General Marshall, you and several other attorneys general, including Alan Wilson from South Carolina, penned a letter to 53 asset managers. In this letter, you said that state and federal laws require these asset managers to act as a fiduciary in the best interests of their clients and exercising due care and loyalty. So today I want to take a quick look at the history of fiduciary. Starting with the basics, the Bible says that no one can serve two masters. The Romans defined a fiduciary as a person holding the character of a trustee or character analogous of a trustee in respect to the trust and confidence involved in it and the scrupulous good faith and candor which it requires. The case of Keach versus Sanford, a 1727 English trust law, holds that a trustee owes a strict duty of loyalty and care so that there can never be any possibility of a conflict of interest. Under ERISA, a person who provides investment advice has that same fiduciary obligation to provide the advice in the sole interest of the plan participants. It's clear that the history of fiduciary is not a new concept. So why are these asset managers now struggling with that duty? When someone invests their money, they have the intention that this money will grow and that they will get a return on that investment. However, these asset managers are throwing money in support of ESG initiatives that are contrary to those who have those holdings. Attorney General Reyes and Attorney General Marshall, will asset managers be forced to choose between their legal duties to achieve financial returns and ESG policy goals, and can you outline that?
I think clearly there is a conflict. And one of the things that I would identify previously is the role of pension funds in states. And we've had two of our attorneys general, both in the states of Kentucky and Louisiana, in examining the question of fiduciary duty, have concluded the consideration of ESG factors would in fact violate state law. The laws in Kentucky and Louisiana are very similar to the laws throughout our country, very similar to the way that this body has defined fiduciary under ERISA, and has identified that as the sole interest duty of loyalty. Very specifically, the Michigan Supreme Court many years ago said that a business corporation is organized and carried out primarily for the profit of stockholders. The role of asset managers is to maximize the return on that investment. Again, particularly for the hardworking Americans who have invested their retirement dollars, their concerns principally is what's going to be there when I'm done. It's not necessarily on some of the factors that are subjective within ESG, but instead to those objective factors that qualify to determine what investment should be recognized. Interestingly, my colleague from Illinois referenced glasses and an optometrist that had given him the glass prescription. An optometrist uses devices to objectively determine what your vision is, to be able to make sure that you have the right glasses, that you're not using the wrong ones. ESG criteria very differently are not objective, they're subjective. And one of the reasons why we know that is the rating agencies themselves can't agree on what the factors should be, and they also score individuals quite differently depending on their subjective view of those companies. One thing that's also clear is that certain subjective ESG factors are in conflict. For example, let's take solar powers. That if you have a company you want to be able to score well because they have converted to solar energy, we also have to recognize that that solar energy is coming from materials and manufactured in China where forced labor practices are not acceptable. Which one do you favor more?
Attorney General and Attorney General Reyes, I want you to answer this one if you can for me, because I'm crunched for time, but are asset managers required to tell their clients when they enter in these ESG-related pledges? I mean, doesn't that seem to be kind of a problem? Because my understanding is that they do not have to disclose that.
I'm sorry, could you repeat? I know your time's up, but I didn't.
Are asset managers required to tell their clients when they enter into these ESG-related pledges?
Not currently, and that would be something that the Trump rules that the Department of Labor rule just changed previously required. If it was a tie and it's an intricate answer, but yes, there had to be transparency and disclosure and an explanation. Those rules have now gone away because of the current administration's hostility, again, towards that. So it would be advisable, but there's not a requirement per se. You could read into their fiduciary duty, and I think implicitly there ought to be, but right now there's no statutory duty.
Thank you both. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes Ms. Porter from California for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Attorney General Marshall, we have different political views, but I'm going to predict that we might be able to agree on something right at the outset. I think the United States should have the strongest possible capitalist economy that it can. Do you agree?
I do.
All right. And capitalism is a lot like democracy. You get choices. And just like a democracy lets you choose between different candidates who may have very different political views, capitalism is supposed to let you choose between more than one product, service, or investment that meets your needs. Do you agree that choice is a fundamental premise of capitalism?
I do not disagree.
All right. Do not disagree. I'm going to take that as agree.
I will say it again. I agree with you.
Thank you. Mr. Marshall, when you buy a car, what criteria do you look at to make your final decision? What's important to you?
The quality of the vehicle and the cost.
Okay. The car that's best for you may not be the car that's best for me. I drive a minivan, and you maybe wouldn't be caught dead in one. For all I know, maybe you're a Tesla guy.
I drive a pickup, Congressman. Let me make that clear.
Well, I was going to get to that. You might. I have a lot of constituents who buy low-emission vehicles. You may have a lot of constituents who buy trucks to use for towing or hauling. The thought process behind shopping for a car is not so different from the thought process that goes into investing in a company. You gather information to see if you're getting what you want as a consumer or, in this case, an investor. Mr. Marshall, what kind of information would an environmentally conscious investor be looking for? Let's assume that these investors exist. What would they be looking for to make an investment that meets their needs?
I couldn't answer that question for you. I don't know exactly how you define what it is you're talking about.
Okay, so I think they're going to be looking for information about what the company's policies are to mitigate climate change risk, how they're addressing fluctuating energy costs that might be related to changes in market prices and availability of fossil fuels. They might be looking at how water shortages caused by drought might affect their business model, how supply chain interruptions caused by climate migration. There's any kinds of things they could be looking for. The point here is that a lot of investors want to know more than just dollar and cent disclosures when they're making the decision to invest or buy. Maybe you don't. Maybe all you want to look at is the dollars and cents. But environmental, social, and governance disclosures give those investors the option to take that information into account. And it's not just progressives. Plenty of conservatives have dumped their stock in Disney or stopped buying Bud Light because they think that they are too woke. Mr. Marshall, if a company became less woke based on market pressures, would you take legal action against them as AG?
You have to give me a little more information to know whether or not we could.
If Disney changed its policy on LGBTQ plus Americans, would you sue them? If they changed their policy to fail to protect LGBTQ Americans, would you sue them?
I think the analysis for us would not necessarily be whether or not that individual company changed its policy. The question is whether or not they were compelled to do so for otherwise unlawful reasons. It's one of the reasons why you see currently that there are active antitrust investigations involving multiple players on the ESG front, including Climate Action 100 and the Net Zero Banking Alliance. Can I finish, please?
Yep.
Very quickly. And our evaluation there is whether or not their actions incur corporations to make decisions that otherwise wouldn't be appropriate for them to make.
Okay, so let's break this down. It's very important to be clear with the American people. The Labor Department's rule does not impose a mandate. It permits fiduciaries to consider ESG standards if they believe those considerations are prudent in their decision-making and what the information is they want to provide investors. There's no mandate under the Department of Labor. And I think these antitrust concerns are at best misplaced. There is simply no evidence that there is a violation of the Sherman Act going on. There's no evidence that this is what's happening. It is up to each of these companies, to these initiatives are no different than other initiatives that corporations have that come together. These are private actors making their decision. It strains credulity for me to hear people suggest that BlackRock is some kind of leftist commie organization. For crying out loud, BlackRock is about delivering value, and in doing that, they are looking at a lot of different kinds of propositions about value, including good governance, including the effect that climate change may have on their bottom line. That's the whole point. This is about freedom. That's what we're talking about. Capitalism delivers freedom, and that happens when markets let people choose what they want. That's all that you're trying to block here. You're trying to block people from looking at disclosures that they find valuable. If they don't find them valuable, don't look at them. And I think capitalism is about choices. I heard you say you do too, so I hope you'll reconsider your policy. I yield back.
If you want an opportunity to respond, we'll...
Your bathroom break, Mrs.
Chair recognizes Mr. Palmer for 5 minutes.
Thank the chairman and thank the witnesses for appearing today. Attorney General Marshall, Alabama's economy depends on robust industries of agriculture, timber, energy, auto manufacturing, aircraft manufacturing. How would the ESG initiatives potentially harm the state economy and impact consumers, not only in Alabama, but nationwide?
I think first and foremost, Congressman, is on energy prices. If you look particularly what's driven inflation and what's hit Americans in the pocketbook, including Alabamians, it's been an increased cost of energy. Part of that attributable to decreased investment in what is currently producing the energy in our country itself. But beyond that, particularly, for example, within agriculture, is going to be the attack on agriculture as it relates to their responsibility, according to the left, for increased carbon emissions. Let's take, for example, our cattle industry. As you well know, that's a significant portion of our agricultural economy. We also know from data that cows themselves are the largest emitters of methane gas. And the question is going to be, do we find farmers discriminated against in their banking relationships? Do we see farmers discriminated against in other financial relationships that impact their ability to do their job? The reality is, Congressman, I don't think many in my state are ready to give up their hamburger. I don't think they're wanting to put tofu on their grill. The issue is whether or not we can produce the food products this country needs and to be able to do it in a way that we can make it affordable to Americans.
I don't think I'm willing to give up my pickup, or many of my friends who drive pickup trucks are willing to do that either. I want to point out something here. In this headlong rush to eliminate hydrocarbons from our economy, it's really insane. The very things that you have to build a renewable infrastructure, cement, steel, plastics, the majority of that's produced in China, but it all requires enormous amounts of natural gas. But there's one other thing that I'd like to point out. 83% or over 80% of the cost of fertilizer that is necessary for food production is natural gas. And if we eliminated natural gas from that process, it would cut world food production in half. And what we're seeing with ESG driven investments, I think is not only a threat to our economy, it's a threat to our food supply in many respects, but it's also a huge help to China. I made this point this morning in a speech that I gave, that this headlong rush to renewables that Europe engaged in created the energy crisis, not the war in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine exposed it. And if they were to go 100% renewable, they would no longer be reliant on Russia or the United States or anybody else for natural gas, but they'll be reliant on China. And that's one of the big concerns that I have about this big push to ESG is this empowers China. Would you agree with that?
I do agree with that. And interesting, if you look at the history of energy transformation in our country, it's been driven by two sources, one of which is economic and the other is through technology. And it's usually taken a century or more for that to be able to take place. The current change is not driven by any action that this body has taken, but instead it's by global elites who believe there ought to be global energy policy. Not Congress acting, not those that are accountable to the people, but in fact, it is those outside of our country dictating what our policy should be. And it is benefiting China, who, by the way, is not as tied into the Paris Accord as many of our developed countries are. And it gives them an unfair competitive advantage over American companies as well by access to cheap energy.
Well, as I've pointed out in another hearing, China's objective is not to save the planet from climate change. China's objective is to rule the planet as the world's sole superpower, and they want to do that by 2049. And we have this artificial target of trying to achieve net zero by 2050, which under no engineering scenario, no technology scenario is achievable. So now we're getting down where ESG is not only a threat to our economy, it's a threat to our national security. That's my opinion. I believe that as we continue to divest ourselves from our hydrocarbon infrastructure and go more to renewables, it will make us reliant on China for the very materials that we need to sustain our energy infrastructure for our economy and our national security. Would you agree?
I would agree. And I think we should have learned our lesson during COVID when we saw how dependent we were on products produced outside this country when we needed them during the pandemic.
Mr. Chairman, I want to again thank the excellent witnesses, particularly the gentleman from Alabama. I yield back.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Mr. Garcia of California for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank all of our witnesses for their service. Thank you for being here. I know for me, I'm not here to particularly defend any sort of corporate strategy or investment. I think most of the Democrats and the Democrats on this committee are really focused on supporting people, and we're not here to put working people above big corporations. And companies we do know also want to consider certain goals that they have when they're investing, whether it's because climate is obviously changing and it's having an impact. Companies obviously prioritize diversity because America is actually more diverse, and it helps them do business in a diverse society. So these are decisions that make financial sense, and I think corporations are making these all the time. I think what we should also be is honest about what we're actually doing here. I think the majority is clearly trying to score political points with some sort of panic around whatever wokeism is. I'm not even sure what wokeism still is or how to actually describe it. And we have many business leaders in the community that are criticizing this Republican far-right agenda that's ignoring climate change and that really is not operating in any sort of reality, but in some sort of Fox News bubble and ecosystem. So the far-right wants a revenge, and they want a revenge on corporations, on working people, on everybody. The interest campaign that's happening across this country, and certainly here in this committee, is also heavily orchestrated and wide-reaching. ESG efforts have a lot of ties to dark money also across this country. I want to just give an example. I want to ask unanimous consent to submit for the record, a February 2023 article from the group Documented, which describes a private anti-ESG dinner on June 1st of last year during an annual Heritage Foundation meeting. So if I can please have that article submitted for the record. Attendees of this dinner included representatives of Consumers Research, which is an anti-union and anti-quote-unquote woke organization. Now, Mr. Frericks.
Without objection to order.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Frericks, a dinner like this, what does this tell you about coordination behind these kind of anti-ESG attacks?
I think that it's not a surprise. We see it when letters are signed that there's someone behind it.
Thank you. And at the heart of these anti-ESG campaigns is also a name that should be very familiar to the American public, and that's longtime conservative activist Leonard Leo. We all know that Leonard Leo has spent his career installing conservative justices to the Supreme Court in an effort to overturn Roe v. Wade and so much other progress across this country. You also may remember Mr. Leo from recent press reports that have said that he asked Kellyanne Conway and her polling firm to give Ginny Thomas, quote, another $25,000. He emphasized that the paperwork should have no mention of Ginny, of course. Now, we know that Mr. Leo has set his sights on our democracy, on our court. He's amassed $1.6 billion to do it. And so this is incredibly problematic for us as a country. And this is actually what this committee should be looking at. I also want to note an October 2022 article by the New York Times. And in it notes that Mr. Leo's network in his campaign to push some of the country's biggest corporations on making investments, pushing environmental, social, governance causes, all links back to this kind of anti-ESG movement that's happening that we're discussing today. So again, Mr. Frericks, as your perspective as Illinois State Treasurer, how do orchestrated campaigns, clearly as this one, also that have folks like Mr. Leo involved, how does it actually hinder the free market that our Republican colleagues seem to always uplift and care so much about?
When they pass legislation that prohibits disclosure of information, that hinders our ability to make good decisions. When they pass legislation that punishes certain companies from making business decisions, it costs taxpayers in their states, and it's not insignificant dollars. We've documented billions and billions of dollars this legislation is going to cost American taxpayers.
Thank you for that. Now, you signed a letter along with 13 other state treasurers opposing anti-ESG legislation and noted that these radical bans have very real consequences for taxpayers. You've discussed a lot of this today at this hearing, and I appreciate that. The letter warned that if these anti-ESG bans succeed, and I quote, there will be two kinds of states moving forward. States focus on short-term gains and states focus on long-term beneficial outcomes for all stakeholders. And you've alluded to this earlier today. Can you explain one more time, because I think this is a really critical piece of what you focused on today. What exactly do you mean by this part, by this quote in particular?
So when we're investing college savings funds or retirement savings, I'm not so much interested in the next quarter profitability for a company, but their ability to be profitable for the next quarter of a century. That's because as a fiduciary, I'm looking out for those beneficiaries' long-term interests. We are not day traders. We don't hop in and out of these companies. We're universal investors, and rather than trying to boycott certain companies, we try to work with them.
Thank you, sir. And I hope that the next committee meeting we can actually investigate Mr. Leo and his anti-ESG campaigns and support that's happening and causing destruction across this country. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes Mr. Burchett from Tennessee for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate y'all being here, and I apologize that I'm the 435th most powerful member of Congress, and that by the time they get to me, sometimes my questions have already been asked. So when I ask you a question that you've been asked for the third time, I expect each of you to look at me with great respect and realizing that is an incredibly important question at that time, and I'd appreciate that. So thank you, guys. Mr. how do you say your name? Fredericks. You're allowed to smile when a Republican says something. You won't get any trouble, I promise. You're good, brother. Thank you. For me, anyway. Mr. Ray, did I say it right, Mr. Rays? Yes, sir. Mr. Rays, could you explain to me asset managers' fiduciary duties to their clients?
Again, maximize shareholder value, shareholder profit or return. And again, just to follow on the last comments by the congressman, if you'll allow me, we want, as Republicans and Republican AGs, climate debate. We want discussion, we want dispute, we want determination, but we want that here in Congress. And I'm not sure why anybody on either side of the aisle would want to abdicate, would want to allow anyone else to usurp your power in Congress to make these rules. This is the frustrating thing about all of this. This isn't just about ESG information and facts. It's about ESG policy being pushed, again, by a process that totally bypasses Congress and undermines our democratic system. And let me say this, Congressman, if the policies that we're talking about are so self-evident and so popular, has been referenced before, with the American people, let them stand on their own merits here in Congress. Let them be passed into law. Don't let them be forced through a market that is anything but free with these ESG horizontal agreements.
Okay. Along those same lines, could there be a scenario maybe that asset managers would have to choose between ESG initiatives and maybe their fiduciary duty to some of their clients?
Absolutely. Those are at times competing interests. Sometimes they can be aligned. Sometimes you can have social good, you can have stakeholder capital along with shareholder capital all aligned, but at other times they're definitely in conflict.
Well, what kind of risk could these clients face if some of these asset managers perhaps would choose an ESG policy over maybe a financial return?
Well, again, the risk short term is, as I've referenced earlier, a capital risk, a diminution in the value of their investments. But the long-term risk is broader, and that's the concern that we have. The more existential threat is to our system and government, foundations.
Okay. I wonder, is it true that over 300 asset managers signed on to the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative?
I believe that's correct, or more.
Okay, and do they control, I think, over $59 trillion possibly in assets?
AUM, I believe that's right. I think that was in my written statement. I believe that's correct.
Yeah. All right. And are you also aware that the largest asset manager in the world was BlackRock, and they signed on to the NZAM initiative?
They did, and if you add State Street and Vanguard, it's about $26 trillion in assets, which is more than the U.S. GDP. Yes.
Right. One of the initiatives, the NZAM, is to achieve zero emissions by 2050 in accordance with the Paris Agreement. Is that accurate?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Would you consider that to be a radical investment strategy?
Yes, sir. Given the
I realize radical's a little strong, but
the lack of certainty that this would even become a law, that there are going to be requirements. There are a number of reasons why I would say that yes, that is a.
Mr. Marshall, would you agree with that?
I would. Congressman, I also agree that you get more questions per capita in 5 minutes than anybody else on this panel.
Yes, sir. Well, I work on that. And I appreciate you being from Alabama. I know that's a 2-year school. Being in Tennessee, it's a fully accredited 4-year school. And I forget, did y'all play football down there? I can't remember.
Mr. Chairman, can I beg forgiveness?
You're out of order. Okay, Mr. Marshall. Under the Climate Action 100+ initiative, the signers pledged to ensure 166 targeted companies take necessary action on climate change. Does that sound right to y'all?
That's my understanding.
Are any of these signers, do you think they're aware that they have a combined $68 trillion in assets under management?
I think they understand it because they exercise that amount of money to be able to coerce policy changes for companies as a result of that.
Okay, and those are in alignment with the Paris Agreement. I'm out of time. I appreciate y'all very much putting up with this. I know you come in here thinking, wow, I'm going before Congress, and I don't think we're even feeding y'all. But anyway, that's all right. I blame that on it's the Democrats' job to feed y'all. So
thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes Mr. Frost from Florida for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Less than 2 weeks ago, my home state of Florida became one of the first states to pass a law targeting ESG factors and investment recommendations. Just like other anti-woke witch hunts, the Florida legislature and governor are hoping to take their campaign of environmental negligence, social oppression, and incompetent governance to the national level. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed this bill into law even after business leaders, legislators, and public officials warned that similar legislation could hurt investors' bottom line and perpetrate systematic injustices. In January, a consulting firm estimated that just for Florida alone, prohibitions against responsible investing could cost taxpayers more than $300 million. And when a company chronically employs people of color in its lowest paying roles or spills toxic pollutants into the Gulf of Mexico, I believe they become a greater financial risk. They also become more of a risk to the people of the state. Americans don't want to sponsor bigotry, corruption, and the destruction of our climate. And it's not just everyday Americans. Many different folks have been talking about this in the business community. It never ceases to amaze me how far the Republican anti-woke agenda can get from what Americans actually want. Mr. Fredericks, thank you so much for being here. Are you familiar with the November 2022 letter that Republican AGs circulated related to responsible investing?
Vaguely.
Are you also familiar with the letter circulated by 16 attorneys general that eviscerated the Republican attack against the effectiveness and importance of responsible investing?
I've not read both letters recently, but I'm aware of both of them.
Mr. Chairman, I request unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter from attorneys general that clearly outline that responsible investing is sound fiscal policy. Thank you, Mr. Chair. A bill similar to the Florida bill was introduced in Kansas. That bill was projected to cost $3.6 billion over 10 years in lower pension system returns. That bill was met with so much backlash from stakeholders that a Kansas legislator was forced to drop the toughest version of the bill. In Indiana, after researchers reported that an anti-ESG bill would cost its pension system $6.7 billion over 10 years, lawmakers were also forced to rewrite the bill before it could pass. Similar pushback stalled efforts like this in North Dakota as well. Mr. Frerichs, why do you think these bills are facing so much backlash, even in Republican states?
I think they're facing backlash because they're anti-free market. They're going to cost the taxpayers money. It's being pushed by a special interest out there. You know, I heard talk about we want Congress to make these decisions. If Congress is going to make the same decisions that are costing these states billions of dollars, they will cost this country trillions of dollars. I would say, what happened to the argument of states' rights? In Illinois, we want the right to consider all of this data. If another state doesn't want to and they want to get lower returns, that is their choice. We believe in choice. Don't take away our choice.
Yeah, I asked myself the same questions about rights of local government and states' rights. You know, in my state of Florida, that has completely gone out the window. This is not the same. This isn't your father's Republican Party. If states like Florida or Texas blacklist the largest municipal bond underwriters, mind you, these bonds fund some of the most basic functions of cities like in Orlando, this could impose a hidden tax amounting to hundreds of millions of additional dollars on those trying to engage in good business practices. Who would ultimately bear this hidden tax?
The taxpayers of the state of Florida. You'd find if nothing is done in terms of climate change, there is great risk to the homeowners of Florida, especially along the coasts. There is risk to farmers in Florida. I heard people say that they care about agriculture. Climate change is a real risk. We have seen an increase in storms, in some states an increase in droughts, and others an increase in flooding, but all of this disrupts our agriculture, which feeds this country. These are things that need to be considered.
Exactly. We've seen an increase in storms, and we've seen those same storms become longer and worse and devastating effects. Entire cities in Florida were decimated due to the hurricanes last year. These anti-ESG laws benefit no one, not everyday Americans who want to see our financial sector invested in for what's good for America, not stakeholders. And once again, Republican lawmakers are trying to restrict individual liberty and force compliance with policies that the majority of Americans oppose. This is especially shown by the backlash that many of these bills have faced in both Democratic and Republican-controlled states. Thank you so much for your time, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes Mr. Fallon from Texas for 5 minutes.
New rule of the Biden Labor Department, thank you, Mr. Chairman, to allow ESG to be taken into account and prioritized over fiduciary duty not only violates current law, but also common sense. So what's more powerful? I thought we were proud to be a rule of law nation. So the rule of law should be more powerful than the law of rule. Retirement, it's pretty straightforward. Under federal and state law, asset managers owe a fiduciary duty to their clients. Essentially, this means that they'll put their clients' interests first. When asset managers enter into ESG pledges or commitments, they violate their fiduciary duty and instead place undue risk on their clients' investments. See, if a retirement plan fiduciary must make investment decisions and exercise shareholder rights based on solely whether or not they enhance retirement savings. That's straightforward, that's simple, it's clear, and it's smart. And quite frankly, anything else is an attack on capitalism. So we had a chart here earlier from one of my colleagues that had ESG investments all really high, and the traditional investments were lower. So that was compelling. Is it true? Because if it was, it would seem that would already fit in to the definition that I just read about being and acting in your client's best interest. But unfortunately, it's not. Bradford Cornell of UCLA and Aswath Damodaran of New York University reviewed shareholder value created by firms with high and low ESG ratings and scores provided by professional rating agencies. And their conclusion was, and I quote, telling firms that being socially responsible will deliver higher growth, profits, and value is false advertising. What they found at the micro level was also on the macro level. Over the past 5 years, global ESG funds have underperformed the market by 250 basis points, 6.3% as opposed to the 8.9% you would have received under traditional investments. This means that an investor that's going to put in 10 grand comes out with 13.5 instead of 15,250. So it's interesting to note, too, a new report from researchers from the universities of Utah, Hong Kong, and Miami found there's no evidence that socially responsible investment funds improve corporate behavior. Now, why is that? And that's very simple. The production of goods and services declines only when people stop buying them, not when others stop investing in the companies that produce them. This is merely another attempt by the far left to perform an end around of current law, meddling in free markets, to compel behavior and achieve their dreams of a non-existent socialist utopia. What you get, and you're paying for it, what you get is more risks, more danger, less stability, and fewer returns. And the ESG ratings, by the way, themselves are all over the board. So consider this. Broadly accepted financial accounting practices have enabled competing rating agencies, competitors, like Fitch and S&P and Moody's, to reach similar credit evaluations 99% of the time. ESG counterparts can't say the same thing. MSCI and Sustainalytics, they only reach the same ratings 54% of the time, just about 1 in 2. So the ratings are incredibly discretionary. Attorney General Marshall, is this the role of the federal government? Should Joe Biden be able to gamble with retirement funds and pensions of the American worker?
No, and we've heard during this hearing today that this is as a Republican issue. In fact, dealing with ERISA has been a bipartisan issue that the Senate showed very strongly when they voted to overturn the rule that the Department of Labor had advanced, as well as the one that we're currently litigating. The concern has to do with what does it mean to be a fiduciary, and what are we doing to be able to protect the hard-earned dollars and investments of American workers. Clearly, this administration has gone too far.
Attorney General Reyes, federal, state, and local governments defined benefit plans make up $7.6 trillion of the $33.5 trillion U.S. investment retirement market. How does funneling these workers' retirement funds toward varying lobbying efforts impact these governments' ability to function independently?
I'm going to quote from the Vanguard CEO when he pulled Vanguard out of the NAZM. He said, we cannot state that ESG investing is better performance-wise than broad index-based investing. Our research indicates ESG investing does not have any advantage over broad-based investing. This ERISA rule, again, critically important to 152 million working Americans. That's out of a total of 158 for $12 trillion of their hard-earned dollars. And again, as you noted earlier, Congressman, the rule is violative of ERISA on its face, and we believe defective for a number of other reasons that we're confident will prevail on in court.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes Ms. Balint from Vermont for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, gentlemen, for being here. I'm sure it's been quite grueling to get to this point. So I want to just say I'm a former public school teacher, and I earned a state pension through that work. And I really see my job today as trying to explain to Vermonters why the topic of today's hearing matters to them. So if you have a public pension or a retirement plan, or if your retirement savings are invested in the market, this matters to you. And considering environmental, social, and governance factors in investment decisions, I believe, is just good fiduciary practice. And in fact, considering ESG factors, also known as responsible investing principles, are part of an asset manager's fiduciary duty to their clients, who are regular people. They are teachers, first responders, nurses. Mr. Frayricks, how would you define an asset manager's fiduciary duty to the layperson? How do you explain it to regular people who may be watching this?
To make investments to get the greatest return for the time period that the pensioners or the beneficiaries would need them.
So would you say an asset manager has a responsibility always to act on behalf of the client's best financial interests when they're managing their accounts?
Most certainly.
Would you agree that an asset manager's fiduciary duty requires the consideration of issues that affect a company's financial performance and its bottom line?
Correct, I would.
And so you said earlier, and I thought this was great, you said we are not day traders, right?
Yes.
We're looking for investments in the long term. And certainly I think about that with my pension. I want to make sure that whoever is managing those investments is thinking about factors over the long term. So to make it extremely clear for everyone, how do ESG factors help an asset manager assess investments? Because that's what we're talking about here. Am I making the right investments? Flesh that out for us if you could.
These factors all deal with risk. We're universal investors. When you're investing hundreds of billions of dollars, you don't sort of pick and choose a couple of companies out there. What you try to do is engage with the companies you invest in and make sure they continue to be sustainable over the long run. We want these companies to be profitable. But if you make short-term decisions, now if you're trying to be profitable this quarter, there are easy levers to pull. You can stop spending on R&D. You can lay off employees. You can raise prices. And that will make you profitable in the short run, but in the long run, your customers, with those increased prices, may leave you. Those employees that you laid off, the remaining ones, may be despondent, they may be demoralized, they may slow down, they may go on strike. If you stop investing in R&D, your competitors will overtake you in the future. And so the question is the time frame. Do we want companies making decisions for the short run or for the long term? And as someone in charge of managing college savings funds, retirement funds, pensions, we invest for the long run.
And the other thing that I thought was really interesting is, as a colleague said earlier, this is not a mandate, right? This is about being permissive. So do Republican efforts to prohibit the consideration, just the consideration of these factors create legal risks for fiduciaries going forward?
Let me say, investing is hard. There's lots of information out there, lots of data you have to consider. If someone doesn't want to do that work, that's okay. I would say they're not doing their fiduciary duty if they don't do that. But if they limit my ability to have access to data, to consider all kinds of variables out there, they're making it difficult for me to maximize returns for the beneficiaries for the long run.
So essentially, they're taking tools away from you that would enable you to make the best decisions on behalf of your clients.
Correctly, and I'm not trying to take any tools away from them. If they don't want to look at these risk factors, they don't have to. We don't mandate that. But what state legislatures are doing is they're mandating that our asset managers, that our advising firms cannot provide us with this data, and that is dangerous. It is dangerous for Americans, it's dangerous to pensioners, it's dangerous for those teachers who are retiring on a small pension.
I'm so glad that you just boiled it down, because that's what we're talking about here. We're saying you can't have the information that you need to make the best possible decisions for your client.
Exactly.
It's absurd, right?
Yes.
Okay, just want to be clear here. So, responsible investing means gathering information about and considering ESG factors, or among others, that help you determine the best choice for your client. And I just want to say this is just such a dangerous path that we're going down here. It goes along with the book banning that we had earlier. Taking away information from people is not what this government is supposed to be about. Thank you.
Thank you.
Chair recognizes Ms. Luna from Florida for 5 minutes. Beforehand, I want to publicly say congratulations on your great news.
Thank you. It's like the best kept secret in Washington. I'm expecting, so yeah, thank you guys.
And I thought it was interesting. How many members of Congress have delivered a baby?
I'll be number 12, so it's 0.1%.
20 in the history of Congress.
12.
12. 12 female, 12 ladies have delivered babies while in Congress. I think that's a pretty interesting statistic. So congratulations, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. I want to start out by saying I think investments made on behalf of the American people by assets managers should serve in the interest of the investor, not woke ideologies being pushed by corporate financial institutions and to entities like the SEC. Honorable Reyes, I actually really liked how you kind of unloaded with some facts, and so if I have time at the end of this, I want to yield to just kind of let you speak on what you think it's important for the American people to know. But if I could just real quickly ask you a few questions. What are the challenges faced by companies in dealing with increasing numbers of shareholder proposals, especially those related to ESG metrics?
Well, they're being forced to themselves choose a path that may not be yielding the best returns to their own investors. They may be forced to make choices that push their own customers away from their own products. I mean, there are a whole host of different problems that this type of pressure can have on a particular company. And then on the other side, there are a lot of problems, as we've already discussed extensively, with investors and the potential loss of capital investments. All of those things are problematic, Congresswoman.
How often are clients informed that their asset managers are prioritizing ESG metrics over their financial return?
No, their asset managers are required to disclose what they're investing in, but I don't think it's readily apparent to most people that their investments are necessarily being invested with an ESG bent, right? So again, transparency laws and requirements would behoove, I think, the whole process, and that's what we're here again to talk about. Not the policy, but the process, how this is being effectuated. Is it being done fairly and in a free market, or is it being done coercively?
I think it's very interesting that obviously there are many things that my colleagues across the aisle and I probably disagree on. Probably agree on some and mostly disagree on most. But I think it's very interesting that in this type of situation that you have people that sometimes blindly trust and really don't know that they might necessarily be investing in something that goes against what their moral principles are or whatever it might be. So
yeah, I don't think most of us even understand the power that we have to vote our shares. The vast majority of Americans are working hard and trying to raise families and not paying attention. So that's part of the problem, and they rely too heavily on proxy services or their asset manager to make those decisions for them. Again, let me make this point, Congresswoman. We've never disputed your own ability to invest whatever assets you have the way that you want to, including an ESG program. But when you're an asset manager investing on behalf of others, it's an entirely and wholly different circumstance, and you have to live up to that fiduciary duty.
So we have about 2 minutes left, and I want to yield the rest of my time to you. What is the most important takeaway for the American people to know from this hearing today?
Well, again, I'd like to point back to the three things that we talked about. One was the DOL rule, but we've already covered that, I think, sufficiently. The second, going back to why the SEC would not exclude a shareholder proposal that violates state laws, against anti-discrimination laws, and that's something that I hope that the committee will take up and have a hearing on. The SEC could have easily excluded that. They chose not to. And again, this is in the context of proxy groups. It was because of my contention, the pressure of a proxy service, that the shareholders garnered enough votes. They didn't win, but they came a razor's edge of prevailing 47% to literally put their own company in harm's way by violating a number of state laws. So that's one. The other is going back to FERC, and if this committee would look at organizations like NZAM and Climate Action 100, again, $68 trillion or $59 trillion AUM, and view them to see if they are a holding company, as we believe they should be construed under FERC. They're acquiring more than $10 million in other utilities. It's problematic because if they are a holding company, then they're violating a number of FERC regulations, including owning more than 20% of a particular utility. They own multiple utilities in excess of 20%. FERC requires asset managers to be passive, and these horizontal organizations are anything but passive. They are bluntly and very self-aggrandizingly clear about what their intent is, and that, we believe, also violates FERC's prohibitions on asset managers being not passive and trying to operate the utilities. So those are the areas, again, that I would like for the committee to be able to take up. Again, appreciate your time. Congratulations to you. I have 6 kids of my own, and this is the best news I heard all day.
Thank you, Chairman. I yield my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair recognizes Ms. Lee from Pennsylvania for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Every day, it seems like there's a new acronym that my Republican colleagues are afraid of, or fear-mongering and driving up some fear around. I'm having a really difficult time keeping up with them, so I think, like some of my colleagues before me, I hope that we can use this time to kind of get to the heart of what this is about. Mr. Freyricks, I was wondering if you can help me with a quick hypothetical, and of course, please forgive me if any of this is a bit repetitive, but we're all just trying to figure out how to deliver this information best to our districts. So let's say I'm a first-time investor looking to start my retirement fund, and we're discussing how to invest the money I've earned, or I've saved, excuse me. Yes or no, would you consider the average earnings over the past few years of a company and the growth of the overall industry?
Yes, most certainly.
Would you look at it? If the board had been recently accused of fraud or mismanagement?
That would be a risk.
Would you consider how compliant a company is with EPA regulations?
Most certainly. You might be able to save money by dumping chemicals illegally, but it will cost you. You can either pay now or you can pay later.
Thank you. Adding to that, why would you look at all of those factors when advising me on how to invest my money?
Because all of them will have an impact on the returns you make.
Thank you. Having as many data points, it sounds like, as possible minimizes risk and maximizes value, making our retirement accounts stronger. The pandemic, rising inflation, and stagnant wages have hit Americans hard over the past few years. Across the board, people are saving less for the future, so every single dollar counts. This Republican crusade against responsible investing is putting Americans' hard-earned savings at risk, and we can't sit by and let that happen. Mr. Freyricks, how will banning responsible investing lead to worse returns for Americans relying on public pensions for retirement?
Let me try and make an analogy here. We talked earlier about buying cars. You know, there are many factors you use in buying a car. You get to look at the car, you get to sit in the car, feel the car, smell the car, see if you like it. You also might consider price. Now, we also say that they should publish miles per gallon. Now, this is like saying, no, that is an environmental impact. You shouldn't be able to know the information on miles MPGs in your car. Miles per gallon will directly affect your costs down the road. You ought to have access to that. These factors that we talked about are similar to that. And these efforts to deny us information on environmental and social and corporate governance issues are making it more difficult for us to be good consumers.
Thank you for that. Republicans would rather force our public servants to throw away hard-earned money and extra fees than simply allow financial professionals to invest responsibly. They're willing to risk the retirement savings of our teachers, our firefighters, our municipal workers, our public servants, all to protect wealthy corporate interests. Limiting responsible investing isn't even a popular concept in Republican-controlled state legislatures, as my colleague from Florida before me mentioned, Indiana as one. The Indiana bill as one such option. Mr. Freyricks, who will be stuck paying the price if Republicans are successful in restricting and banning responsible investing?
It's ultimately on the pensioners, on the beneficiaries of these retirement funds, if they are getting reduced benefits, reduced interest returns, or they're paying more in additional costs like they are in Texas, or like your colleague from Florida pointed out, ultimately it falls on the taxpayers.
Thank you. Typically, responding to these extreme conspiracy theories isn't worth turning our attention away from so many of the important issues facing our country. But propping up their corporate buddies' interests at the expense of Americans' retirement is despicable, and we just can't let that happen. Thank you, Mr. Freyricks and the panel. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Chair recognizes Ms. McLean from Michigan for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here today. I appreciate it. In my opinion, simply put, ESG is a politicalization of investing in and continues to be weaponized by the radical left. I pulled the definition. The primary responsibility of fiduciaries is to run the plan solely in the interest of participants and beneficiaries for the exclusive purpose of providing benefits and paying plan expenses. Fiduciaries must act prudently and must diversify the plan's investments in order to minimize the risk of large losses. Am I correct in that? That's the definition, right? So I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. Mr. Reyes and Mr. Marshall, are asset managers required to tell their clients when they enter into these ESG-related pledges?
I think General Reyes has answered specifically that the answer is no.
No.
That there's not a direct disclosure requirement.
So I want to make sure that everyone understands. I'm an investor. I'm going to invest in ABC fund, right? But you have made an agreement or a pledge with an ESG investment, right? That is based on your belief of what is ESG compliant or whatnot. And you don't have to tell me that you've entered into that pledge. Am I correct in that?
Yes.
Okay. Could you imagine if we did that like with a pro-life or something? I think my colleagues on the other side would actually go crazy. So a follow-up to that. If you're telling me that money managers can invest clients' money into ESG-approved companies without the knowledge of investors, yes, we can do that, right? So I heard the left talk about transparency. Is that a definition of transparent, not being transparent with the investors on the pledges that you've made behind their backs?
I think one of the major issues for attorneys general is for our consumers to make sure they're fully informed in business transactions in which they engage.
I mean, I am all for if people want people to have choice in where their money goes and what they look at, right? But if we're going to be honest and we're going to be transparent, wouldn't it make sense? What's the harm in saying, hey, I entered into a pledge that requires me to do some ESG stuff? What's the harm in that? What are we trying to hide? I don't understand that. Why the lack of transparency?
I'll say from Illinois' perspective, that's not a problem. We publish all of our corporate engagements online.
So
our votes out there.
everyone does
But
that, or just Illinois?
We do that in our office. That's the only office I can control.
Okay, because I don't think, by the answer to my first question, our asset managers, and perhaps I'll repeat it, are asset managers required to tell their clients when they enter into ESG-related pledges? I believe the answer, and we can check the record, was no. So to me, that's lack of transparency. Maybe you have a different definition of transparency, but go ahead, Mr. Reyes.
Congresswoman, since you brought it up, and maybe it was a hypothetical that you were just throwing out, but if truly there were a pro-life agenda and information and there were indexes to establish what companies were doing to foster pro-life or pro-Second Amendment, whatever.
Pick one.
Pro-life, under the same arguments and logic, having a larger workforce would certainly help the economy. And in 18 years, when you have a person of majority being able to enter the workforce, that's certainly even sooner than 2050 goals, ostensibly an even more impactful criteria. Would then my colleagues be equally open to considering all of that information? I don't know, but it's a good hypothetical.
I don't know either, but I have an opinion on where I think they might stand. But at any rate, in my opinion, ESG investments distribute money based on political agendas. That's not their job. It's not to have a political agenda. Rather, their earnings are best returned for savers. I mean, at the end of the day, rate of return needs to matter, because then we're going to go back when all of these investments fail, and we're going to look at the investment companies and say, well, you didn't return your investment. We have to be transparent with the American people. And if we can't be transparent with our ideological views, then what are we hiding? And that's all. That's the purpose in let's just be transparent. And let's be transparent with a concept through all of our investing. And with that, I'm over, so thank you.
Chair recognizes Ms. Crockett from Texas for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And before I begin, let me first just say thank you so much. I sit on the Ag Committee, so you were like feeding my soul as you were talking about the struggles of our farmers, because I've been listening to my farmers talk about the droughts, and I am from the state of Texas where we are enduring droughts, floods, as well as freezes. So we have everything as a result of the thing that really does exist called climate change. So thank you for that. I'm tired of my colleagues on the right using these hearings as a tool for their 2024 campaign. Pretty soon, this committee's majority will need to file with the FEC an in-kind contribution. Instead of talking about how Speaker McCarthy's manufactured crisis on the debt ceiling has led to declines in the stock market, instead of talking about how investors are scared about whether U.S. will pay its bills, today we're talking about their fear of what my colleagues call radical wokeism. ESG is not, I repeat, ESG is not radical or woke. And being from Texas, I can tell you what radical looks like, because clearly we've had some tragedies just this past week because of radical rhetoric, if we're going to talk about what radical looks like. ESG, like any financial information, is just good business. It's another tool in the toolbox to consider advantageous investments and business decisions. Asset managers have a legal fiduciary duty to maximize profits, but it's ignorant to say that to maximize profits, you have to do it at the expense of ESG. That's just false. ESG impacts our investment strategies that incorporate long-term risks to make long-term down payments as well as returns on future breakthroughs. They allow financial professions to manage and promote risk reduction for client investments to maximize returns. I'm surprised our chairman is opposed to this, because just last week, he praised the GAO's high-risk list as a valuable tool for, quote, Congress can make more informed decisions. It's only responsible then that asset managers present all information posing financial risk to clients to allow them to make more informed decisions, especially Americans wanting to responsibly manage their retirement savings. The asset managers offer ESG information because large companies use ESG in their business decisions and investments. Why? Because there are real financial and monetary returns when ESG impacts are incorporated. Attorney General Marshall, yes or no, ESG risks have monetary value that impact financial benefits and corporate opportunities?
I disagree with all of ESG criteria.
Actually, if you look at Royal Dutch Shell's annual reports dating back to 2005, it stated Shell assesses the underlying economic, political, social, and environmental drivers shaping the markets and margins to evaluate commercial opportunities and potential new business models. It has done so in almost every report. If we look back at examples from 2010 and 2022, even Fox News, who my colleagues love, a publicly traded company, in its 2022 annual financial report noted that environmental, including climate, social, and governance matters have costs that pose material adverse effects on its business, financial conditions, and operations. By Republican standards, then, Fox and Shell are advancing radical woke propaganda. I don't see efforts to cancel them or call them out. As Attorney General Marshall said in his written testimony, global elites using ESG, a woke economic strategy to hijack our capitalist system. But I digress. Attorney General Marshall, will you file lawsuits against Fox for breaching its fiduciary duties, or is it just the investment advisors publicly providing information on ESG that you want to target?
Fox doesn't have a fiduciary duty to the citizens of my state.
Just to be clear, ESG isn't woke or radical. It's just good business. Don't take my word for it. A New York University economic study examined over 1,000 reports reviewing the relationship between ESG and financial performance. It overwhelmingly found a positive relation between ESG and financial performance for returns on assets, returns on equity, or stock prices. Why are we wasting valuable time examining ideas that are not in the public interest and which the public has no interest in? I have 30 seconds left, and with that, I would like to yield to the Honorable Treasurer to just offer any thoughts, any additional thoughts that you may have.
Yeah, I'll just say I heard talk about how these ESG data, there's not agreement, that it's difficult, it's all over the board. It's because we are looking at different industries, and there are different risks in different industries. Product safety is a big risk in consumer products.
Yes.
In business services, it's not as big of a risk. Climate change is a big issue for property insurance, but not so large in supplemental insurance.
Absolutely.
I'll repeat that investing is hard. You have to consider different industries. You have to consider a lot of different factors. A lot of people would like to just outsource that. Maybe they don't like their choices, but we take this very seriously. And when you pass legislation to deny us that data, it makes our job that much more difficult.
Thank you so much.
Thank
With
you.
that, I yield.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Langworthy for 5 minutes from New York.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for joining us here today. Asset managers wield tremendous power and responsibility over trillions of dollars in assets, and it's important that they make investment decisions based solely on financial performance and risk management, rather than being swayed by political and social activism. Now, while some view ESG policies and initiatives like Climate Action 100+ as a noble cause, it's important to remember that the companies targeted by these initiatives are also vital to the American economy and provide jobs and livelihoods to millions of our citizens. If these initiatives are successful in imposing additional regulations and restrictions, it could lead to significant job losses and increased financial hardship for many Americans, which leads me to my first question. Attorney General Marshall, Climate Action 100+ has identified companies targeted by asset managers such as Lockheed Martin and Procter & Gamble, which produce military equipment and pharmaceuticals. If there were to be significant change in the allocation of capital towards these companies, how might it affect national security and public health in the United States?
Well, I think it absolutely could impact it based upon the ability of those companies to fulfill their mission. But Congressman, one thing that's been talked about here is the market, and what has been ignored by your colleagues on the left is the fact that the market's not driving individuals to boycott certain segments of industry. They're not asking people to not be financed because of the particular jobs that they do. That's driven by outside agencies, not the market itself. We need to let the market prevail, and if we do so, we have the opportunity to provide goods and services not only to the people of this country, but also to be able to maximize the value to investors.
Thank you. The list also comprises energy producers and utility companies that rely on fossil fuels. If a shareholder proposal were to mandate a company like Xcel Energy, which provides natural gas and electricity to millions of Americans, to entirely abandon fossil fuels, how might that impact the customers and the employees of that company?
Well, look at California, number one, by the way, about whether or not we're going to have rolling blackouts, whether or not we have reliable energy, and whether or not we have affordable power that the citizens of my state can be able to pay. When we have this radical transformation of energy policy, not dictated by the body in which you sit, but instead by global elites, then there's not the opportunity to debate what are the consequences of those decisions. We are already beginning to see that, but yet what may occur in the near future, we still don't know.
Yeah, these companies, whether or not ESG advocates agree, are essential to the American economy. They provide employment to hundreds of thousands of people, as well as essential services to millions. The International Energy Agency concedes that technology to achieve a net zero by 2050 does not yet exist. Does an investment strategy grounded in the basis of that target increase risk to investors?
I think absolutely, and particularly risk as it relates to how it is that we're going to be able to provide cheap energy, which has been the driver of this company across the board to all Americans in all states.
America is already in an energy price crisis, but if these major energy producers, they lose their financial backing or they're forced to abandon fossil fuels, would either of the attorney generals can answer this, would you expect energy prices to rise if they lose significant financial backing?
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, the technology is not to where renewables are going to supply what already is being supplied by those plants that are fueled by natural gas or coal. And if, in fact, we're unable to acquire the resources we need for the power to be generated, which we saw recently that caused the increased price for consumers, then America needs to be ready. We need to be ready to pay higher prices and also have unreliable energy, which we've been able to depend on for at least my lifetime, Congressman, and for others as well.
And on that point, again, Congressman, I'll reiterate what the FERC commissioners just gave us, a dire warning about the stability of the grid and the security of the grid, given current circumstances.
In just in my closing seconds, Attorney General Reyes, I know that many of the companies who do conform to ESG initiatives, they're relying on rare earth minerals, specifically resources that just are not readily available in the United States. There's an overemphasis on companies that rely on these resources, which primarily come from China. Does that compromise American national security, in your opinion?
It absolutely compromises our national security. And in addition, something we haven't mentioned earlier, there are other issues about our southern border security that ESG also compromises. Thank you, Congressman.
Thank you very much, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Chair recognizes Mr. Moskowitz from Florida for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the witnesses for being here today and attending what could be called the Oversight Committee hearing on the death of the free market. I mean, boy, how things have changed in the grand old party. I mean, it used to be about free markets, and it used to be about corporate freedom, and it used to be small government, and it used to be, government out of businesses, government out of the bedroom. Boy, has that pendulum really swung here. I mean, we want government everywhere. I mean, this is like corporate socialism, where we now want the government to tell people that they have to invest in certain companies, like individuals can't make the decision. I mean, it is a wild sort of turn of events for the grand old party. I mean, if Ronald Reagan was here and he was listening to people talk about, that we need government to make sure that people have to invest in companies that, make guns, he wouldn't even recognize you guys. But some of the witnesses, when they were talking about ESG, they talked about as if it was a deadly weapon that's going to destroy our country. It's not. It's not a widely supported investment strategy used to minimize and maximize returns. One of that is shown to offer, greater long-term resilience, lower risks due to factoring in all potential cost to society. But I want to focus on this deadly weapon part. I'm from Parkland, where the shooting was at my high school, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. So if you want clarity on what a deadly weapon is, I can assure you it's not ESG. It's a kid with an AR-15 and unlimited ammunition walking into my school and killing 17 people. So let's have a real sort of grip of reality of what investment strategy is or is not versus what a deadly weapon is. After the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas school shooting, Walmart, Dick's Sporting Goods announced that they would stop selling assault rifles, I applauded them for doing that. And if I want to invest in a company because they've decided to make a policy change, I should have that ability to do so or not do so, by the way. I'm pretty sure I just saw, some of my colleagues going out and, shooting Bud Light cans because, they didn't like what Bud Light was doing. Should we have government mandate that they got to go invest in Bud Light because we want to support Bud Light? I mean, that's what you guys are advocating. It's really kind of crazy. And so, I don't know what we're doing here, Mr. Chairman. This is part one. There's going to be a part two. I mean, part one was just so fascinating. I can't wait for part two. But this committee has not taken any action on gun violence. We want to talk about a deadly weapon. This committee has not looked at all into AR-15s or deadly weapons or school shootings or mass shootings. I mean, you think parents in this country care about ESG? No, they care about dropping their kid off at a movie theater or at a mall, or at school. They don't care about ESG. This is stuff that 10% of Twitter cares about, okay? And so I just want to know when we're going to get serious here. And so, Mr. Chairman, I ask, when is this committee going to have a hearing on gun violence?
You weren't here last year, but all the hearings pertain to the Washington Commanders football team. They pertain to the Equal Rights Amendment. They pertain to abortion. They didn't have a single hearing with a single Biden administration official. They didn't have a single hearing on any type of anything relating to how tax dollars were being wasted by this administration. So maybe you should take the lead in campaigning for your side of the aisle, and then if you all win the majority, then you can have hearings on the Washington Commanders football team again.
No, I'm reclaiming my time, Mr. Chairman. That's fine. I wasn't here, but, you're in charge now, and mass shootings are completely out of control. And so you have the power to make the decision, decide whether we should have hearings on D.C. public urination or on mass shootings. You're the chairman. I'm just a lowly Democratic freshman. And so I implore that this committee start to look at mass shootings and the real weapons that are destroying people's lives, which are AR-15s. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair, recognize myself for 5 minutes. General Reyes, in the letter that you led with your Attorney General colleagues, you said, I quote, "The 2023 proxy season will present multiple occasions on which asset managers will have to choose between their legal duties to focus on financial return and the policy goals of ESG activists." Can you provide some examples that illustrate these occasions?
Sure. Let me give you one very concrete example. I alluded to it earlier, Mr. Chair, but that resolution pertaining to travelers' insurance is back up again for this season of proxy proposals and for shareholder resolutions and voting. And I didn't get a chance to perhaps articulate clearly enough the problematic nature of that situation. So you have a very activist faction of ownership backed by one of the two largest proxy voting agencies pushing a particular agenda that they've agreed upon to conduct racial audits, which may be appropriate or may not be appropriate for other companies or other industries, but certainly are not appropriate for the insurance industry. The directors of Travelers have brought this to the Securities and Exchange Commission, pleading for relief to exclude, which the SEC has the power to do, that type of proxy proposal, that type of shareholder proposal from being even considered. But the SEC has sat on its hands and not done anything to exclude that. So it's back up again. This would require Travelers to then ask for information based on a person's race. They would solicit information for underwriting purposes and for identification, which clearly violate numerous different states' laws.
And I think that's a very good point that I don't think my friends on the Democrat side of the aisle understand. When they talk about ESG, they're just talking about what mutual funds, pension managers can invest in, or treasurers can invest in their pension funds. And Kentucky has the second worst funded pension in America, but we would always say, thank God for Illinois, because it was the one state worse than Kentucky's. But what I don't think the Democrats understand is this affects banking and insurance. It's not just investing. And we've got a problem in our banking industry right now. And we're not going to get into that, but this ESG is a political movement that's gaining ground. It's gaining ground on Wall Street, and it's affecting consumers, not just investors. But you have previously described how the insurers face the dilemmas by pursuing ESG goals. Do you think these insurers are facing these ESG-related proposals that push for unlawful altercations of underwriting activities?
Well, yeah, clearly, it's the same resolution that was proposed the previous year. They're just hoping that they can win over another 3 or 4% and carry the day.
So what risk are the insurers exposed to with the adoption of ESG factors in underwriting?
They'd be potentially liability in dozens of states for breaking the law. And Mr. Chair, you alluded to banking. Although we haven't seen yet concerted efforts to debank solely based on ESG criteria, that's not out of the realm of possibility.
It's not, and if you look at the website for the San Francisco Fed, it was all about ESG policy, and some of the banks, I think Silicon Valley starts.
Well, we just sent a letter to J.P. Morgan Chase with concerns over debanking regarding religious liberties.
Right.
And it's only one step removed
exactly
to then migrate over. If they start to see more and more insurance companies and asset managers withdraw from some of these large horizontal agreements, then you may see more pressure on banks to start debanking.
And I think that is of the utmost importance. Mr. Moskowitz, I don't think understands the issue. He's thinking in terms of Wall Street, but this has a potentially detrimental effect on our ability to bank and insure. This significantly increases liability costs for many industries, which will be passed along to consumers. I don't think my friends on the other side of the aisle have fully comprehended what inflation is and what causes inflation. But you know, my time is expired here. But I'm just amazed at the defense of ESG policies and the defense of why we have to have this type of radical political ideology ingrained in our investing, when we just had a press conference and showed bank records that showed the Biden family getting millions of dollars from places like China and Romania, and I wonder what type of ESG policies China and Romania have. But you all probably can't answer that, but maybe that's something my friends on the other side of the aisle could look into. Chair now recognizes Mr. Burleson.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry, down here, this is General Marshall.
Yes. I'm sorry. I thought it was a member. Yes, General Marshall.
May I briefly be excused?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I'm sorry, Mr. Burleson. It's Ms. Holmes Norton next for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When Chairman Comer announced this hearing, he stated that he shared the concerns of the Republican attorneys general testifying today that ESG principles are being used by progressives to shape corporate behavior. This is a question for Mr. Fredericks. I disagree. Instead of a mixture of political theater and disinformation, Republicans are pandering to anti-ESG stalwarts, including big oil proponents, by attempting to influence the criteria of financial professionals. ESG has wide-reaching support from climate activists to the investment industry to investors, all for different yet legitimate reasons. Climate advocates support ESG principles because they may accelerate the transition to low-carbon economy and could help slow the climate crisis. The investment industry supports ESG because integrating responsible investment factors into the investment process can lead to prudent risk management and potentially better retirement outcomes for millions of Americans. Investors support ESG because as consumers, they demand to invest their hard-earned money in companies that reflect their values and promote governance. Mr. Fredericks, as the Illinois State Treasurer, you are the main investor and asset manager for public funding in your state. Do you support using ESG principles as part of responsible investing for the state of Illinois?
Most certainly we do. It's fundamental to our risk analysis, which is our main responsibility for our pensioners, for our college savers, to make sure that they do not suffer some of those risks that we have seen with collapses of companies like Enron, like Purdue Pharma.
Would you say there is widespread support for ESG in Illinois across political spectrums?
I would say within the investment community, there has been increasing support. A significant percentage of investors, public asset managers out there, consider this ESG data in their investments. The only thing radical going on right now, the only major change going on is this pushback. I hear a lot of concern for banks being bullied or muscled or told what to do. But I only know of one piece of legislation in the state of Texas that told banks where they have to invest. If you had asked me 30 years ago what I thought the odds of me defending the free market against a Republican legislature trying to have a planned economy mandating what businesses have to invest in, I would have laughed. But that's where we are today.
Well, Mr. Frederick, support for ESG is derived not only from investors wanting to ensure their money is going to worthy companies, but also the financial benefits of responsible investing. According to research on returns from responsible investment, taking into account ESG factors offers greater long-term resilience and lower risks due to factoring in all potential costs to society, such as climate change and pollution. For example, companies that are less reliant on fossil fuels are more likely to be considered good long-term investments than companies that remain heavily dependent on them. Similarly, corporations that are more diverse and more reflective of the U.S. population are better suited to meet the needs of consumer demands of an increasingly diverse marketplace. Mr. Fredericks, can you explain why these types of considerations are so important to investors?
Well, I can explain, or I can ask a question, do you know which companies out there were happy that they made efforts over the last several years to decarbonize? European countries affected by Vladimir Putin's war against Ukraine and with a rising spike in energy costs are happy they made those decisions. They limited risk from things like that aggression, but they also benefit from this climate transition. This is not all about costs. There are opportunities that come with climate change. And businesses that are positioning themselves to be at the forefront there are businesses that are going to be profitable in the future. Those are the businesses we want to be investing in.
ESG is widely supported across the country and the political spectrum. Countless investors and asset managers have pivoted to focus on responsible investing because of the benefits it provides for the world and Americans' wallets. I yield back.
Chair recognizes Mr. Timmons from South Carolina for 5 minutes.
For Congressman Timmons, I am not running away, but I could also use a slight break. I'll be back shortly.
Can you go in 5 minutes, please?
Sure.
All right, sorry. I'm literally only asking you questions.
Great, okay.
Sorry, I appreciate that. We will let you leave right after this. So I guess let's just talk about the goals of ESG. The ESG movement is designed to protect the environment. We all want that. Social, is to facilitate a cleaner environment for generations to come. Social, we want every business and their teams to facilitate a working environment that everyone is accepted, is paid a reasonable wage, appropriate with their skill set, and as governance, and I'm in the military, I'm in the Air Force, and we talk about this a lot. We want every decision-making room to reflect the people that they serve, whatever those percentages are. And so those are the goals. And so you reference two things that I just totally disagree with have anything to do with ESG. Litigation risk for pharma and understaffing for whatever business you're referencing. Those are not ESG. That is a legitimate thing to take into account as it relates to the profitability of a business. If they're going to get sued and lose hundreds of billions of dollars, that's going to affect their bottom line. Understaffing, it could result in a worse good or product, which could also subject it to major challenges in their profitability. So, and you also referenced football being merit-based, and I would argue that professional sports might be the single most merit-based because they want to win, but almost zero professional team reflects the makeup of the people that they serve, whether it's the United States, whether it's local. So, I mean, I don't see that as being relevant. So you also talk about the fact that this is important. Everybody wants to do this, but I'm okay with Illinois doing whatever y'all want to do. But you currently have a $140 billion deficit with your pension. And when you go into austerity measures, you're going to come to Congress and you're going to say, we have a massive deficit, we're going to have to go into austerity measures, it's going to impact all these people, it's going to be so sad. But I would argue that the decisions you are making, specifically as it relates to enforcing your proxy voting rights, to basically try to make, I mean, I guess this is the governance social component of it, but it's not merit-based. It's not designed to return, to make a return on that investment. And so in a world where gender, where sexual orientation, where race have become fluid, I mean, these are things that change, how do you justify putting emphasis on that as it relates to your proxy voting rights? How do you not see that that is not a merit-based and that is going to result in a lower return, and it's going to cause more problems than you're having right now with your pension?
Okay. I've explained this before, and I'll explain it again because I think there's a misunderstanding of what ESG is. ESG is data. And you said all those goals that I have, those are not my goals. So my goals are to maximize returns.
There's no data that shows that if you have a certain number of men and women or minorities on a board, that board is going to produce better results. I would actually even argue that there is recent evidence that shows the opposite. SVB and Signature Bank, most of their emphasis was not on the nuts and bolts of banking. It was on diversity inclusion, it was on ESG, and they failed. And you know what, this is the problem? My constituents, the people that I represent, have to pay for it because the systemic risk measures that were taken by Treasury and by the FDIC results in higher FDIC premiums for the banks that I serve. So again, I don't care what you do in Illinois, but don't come to me when you bankrupt your pension. Don't come to Congress when you bankrupt your pension and think we're going to bail you out like we bailed out SVB and Signature Bank. Well, you're not yet. You're not yet because you're actually violating your fiduciary obligations to your to the pension by not focusing on a return on the investment. You're focusing on things like gender and race and sexual orientation, which that has nothing to do with merit.
Yeah. I believe these recordings are videotaped, and you will find, if you listen to my comments, that those are, in fact, my requirement. My request is returning a fiduciary duty. Silicon Valley Bank did not fail because of focus on woke. It failed because they didn't listen to their risk managers.
They didn't have risk managers. I'm sorry. They didn't have risk managers because they had 3 diversity officers. Well, but they had 3 diversity officers. Do you not see the emphasis on ESG, on diversity, as being a problem to pursuing profit, which is basically what happened there, and it's what you're doing.
Sure. You mentioned diversity on boards. There are no quotas out there, but research has shown, multiple research undertaken shows that diverse boards outperform homogeneous boards. We're not excluding anyone, but saying that getting more different opinions from different backgrounds on the table produce better results.
In this case, having people that have experience in banking would result in SVB and Signature not failing. Instead, they were focused on diversity inclusion. They're focused on gender, on race, and on sexual orientation and pronouns. And that's why we need to stop this, and we need to focus on fiduciary obligations and getting a return for your investors. Thank you. I yield
They
back.
focused too much on one specific risky industry. They didn't have risk managers they were listening to. That was the cause.
Mr. Chairman.
Demise.
Dude, just a moment. Does gentleman yield back his time? Gentleman yields back his time. Does gentleman seek?
I seek a unanimous consent just to introduce an article on this very point saying SVB's collapse was a failure of governance and describing it as a textbook case of corporate mismanagement. And it's from Axios, so I'd like to introduce that.
Without
to the
objection, we'll enter
Thank
that
you.
into the record.
Thank you.
Does gentleman seek further time?
No.
Thank you very much.
Thank you much. Thank you.
The gentleman, Mr. Rokana, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Attorney General Marshall, I want to see if we can find...
Excuse me just a minute. Will the gentleman, hold on just a moment, please. Does the gentleman seek agreement that he could go use the outside services?
Go ahead.
Okay, I'm trying to make sure because I don't want to interrupt if that's the question. Okay. Sir, the rooms might be outside and to the left.
We got one back.
Okay, got one back there. Okay, excuse me. The gentleman now will be recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Attorney General Marshall, I want to see if we can find some common ground. I assume you would agree with me that if BlackRock or a company wanted to prioritize investments for things that were made in America, that would be okay.
The question is whether or not that's going to maximize the return for the investor in that fund.
But you wouldn't agree. I mean, I believe that it is fine for companies to prioritize goods made in America, made in Alabama, made in the United States, regardless of profit maximization. You would disagree with that?
I would disagree with that. The role of the fiduciary is to maximize the benefit for that individual for whom they represent.
Okay,
That is
well,
a sole, if I can finish, please, sir. It's a sole interest duty of loyalty that exists for that fiduciary. And if, in fact, investing in a company that produces American goods is not profitable, nor does it provide a return, then that individual will be acting contrary to their duty of loyalty to that particular investor.
Well, we just disagree with this. I think your view is more of a globalist view. I'd be curious what President Trump thinks, actually, because my view is that American investment firms should prioritize investing in making things in America. I thought that was half of the former president's campaign. So we just have a philosophical disagreement on that. Let me ask a second question. I assume you would be fine if BlackRock says, even though the vast majority of profit maximization would mean investing in China, which, by the way, they have said that's the highest returns, we're going to choose not to invest there because of the human rights violations of the Uyghurs. Would you be for them maximizing their profits and investing in China, or would you support them not investing in China because of human rights concerns?
Obviously, BlackRock has multiple investment vehicles for which people can choose. If, in fact, they have a global fund in which they are investing in China, then the investor has an opportunity to determine whether or not...
Would you say it's fair for BlackRock to make a decision that they should not invest in China, even if that's higher returns, because they have a problem with the human rights view and the Uyghurs?
I think the question is, what is the purpose of the fund? What is the defined investment goal that's there?
Yeah, they're
and then they can make a decision about whether or not it's appropriate return for that particular investor.
So if they made a decision, if Larry Fink said, we're not investing in China, in regions with the Xinjiang, where there are Uyghurs, would you be fine with that?
Tell me again this.
Uyghurs are basically oppressed in China, and if BlackRock said we're not going to invest there because we're concerned about the human rights violations, would you be fine with that?
BlackRock has an opportunity to define the fund, how it would be invested, and how it is that they choose
So you would
for
be
those
fine
particular investors.
if they made a decision on human rights grounds, would you be fine with that?
It's a broader issue than that, Congressman.
Well,
as
no,
far
I'm
as
just asking.
no, sir, you're not. Let me answer
just
my
finish, 'cause
question. You may have an agenda that you want to ask with this question,
No,
but what I'm answering for you
I
is.
reclaim my time. Let me ask you, Chairman Gallagher, I'm on the China Committee. We have had Republicans lecture BlackRock saying that they should have the values not to be investing in China, even if it's profit maximizing because of the human rights violations with the Uyghurs. Would you support that view?
First of all, I don't know exactly the circumstances that you're talking about in China.
That's shocking that you don't know the Uyghurs and the human rights violations there.
Can't tell you that I know anything about it, sir.
Well, I suggest maybe you should read up on it because it's a huge concern for America. But would you support that view? I mean, I'm just trying to say, where do you think values matter? Would you have supported the view that we should not be investing in Germany during World War II?
I think the issue for investment companies is whether or not they are finding that they are complying with their fiduciary
Attorney
duty.
General Marshall, I guess here's my point. Do you think there is ever a point that values of standing up against the human rights views of China, values of standing up against Nazism, values of standing up against Stalinism, do you believe there's ever a time that values should trump profit maximization?
They have the right to choose not to invest in companies that they believe create certain risks. That's what the market provides.
And that once you open that door, once you say that they have the right to, as you said, not invest in companies that have certain risks, or I would say companies that offend for certain fundamental human values, then the question is who gets to decide what those values are? And my view is it shouldn't be the government deciding what those values are. It shouldn't be you or I. It should be in the free market, these companies. If you're saying it's fine that they should not be investing in China, that they should not, with human rights violations, then what's the difference between that and a company that says they don't want to invest in something because of climate?
I don't believe that a small cabal of financial institutions ought to decide what are preferred societal values or global energy policy.
But that's not the case. The case is you're not even letting the cabal, you're not even letting them invest in America. And then you're telling them don't invest in China on the Uyghurs, and I hope you are, and then you're saying, though, that you're defining these values narrowly. Anyway, my time has expired.
Gentleman yields back his time. Thank you very much. I'll now yield myself 5 minutes. Gentlemen, thank you, all three of you, for being here. You have withstood questions and ideas from about 15 on each side. This has gotten to be a little bit larger conversation than perhaps you thought you might be engaged in, but it's pretty normal for us. And we try and tout the things we believe in, and we try and perhaps don't tout those things we don't agree in. But thank you to all three of you for being here and putting up with us. I'm an old guy. I believe that the role of government is not to pick winners and losers. I believe it was to serve appropriately people, provide government services, to do so in a fair and equitable way, to not overtax and not underdeliver. But I believe that government has a role, and it's not necessarily the activist governments that we have seen lately. If you go back about 2 hours ago, there was a discussion about prudent risk management, lowering risk. Oh, look at the long term, maybe 20 years of a return. Well, that's good if you can do that. But I would say to the gentlemen, the Attorney Generals, that I have looked at the trends as of late in each of the last probably 5 years, but 3 years I've gone back and looked. California, New York, and Illinois have all lost hundreds of thousands of people. 151 billionaires have moved out of California. That's economic. People moving, notwithstanding, in 109 out of 111 counties or so in Illinois have decided to leave the state. States have their own opportunity to do as they would choose. But activist governments, just like our federal government now, are lending themselves to picking winners and losers, making decisions for people, and doing things off their own regard, even in midst of our nation being probably a 50-50 country. And I find that this argument that we're into today about the role of ESG as being very germane to whether the country is going to be successful or not. We are dividing ourselves in this country, and people arbitrarily are moving, notwithstanding to my home state of Texas, but in that process, dividing us. Mr. Marshall, Mr. Reyes, please tell me, you come from two states that I don't think you try and divide each other. You don't try and pick winners and losers, but you do see where there are marketplace problems out there where people are doing that. Are you rejecting those ideas, or you're simply trying to philosophically say, let's let our state, business decide where it goes, schools decide where they go, and try and be successful? Mr. Marshall.
It is clearly the latter. One of the things that we have attempted to advance here today is this is not an objection to the individual investor. This is a question about whether those with outsized influence as a result of the assets in which they manage have the ability to dictate public policy that ought to be decided by accountable legislative bodies, as well as companies, pension funds, being able to dictate societal values in places in which they are not present. That's the purpose of this hearing today, I believe, and it's the focus of what we've talked about.
Thank you. Mr. Reyes.
Definitely the latter, Mr. Chairman. And we are proud in Utah to be a fiscally conservative state that have seen in-migration from many of those states that you've referenced because they value the cleanliness and the success and the business opportunities, the family-friendly environment of our state, and then, ironically, quickly try to change our values and our way of life, importing the very things they just fled from. ESG is part of those policies and a process that thwarts the free market that caused them to leave where they came from and enjoy where they're living now in the great state of Utah. So I appreciate, on behalf of my citizens who are very concerned about this on many levels, this being ESG, not just data in in a free market, in a vacuum that allows people to make decisions without coercion, but in an environment where every major pressure point is choking out decisions and the free will of everyday Americans and hurting them at their pocketbooks, hurting them in their long-term savings, hurting them at the gas pump. And these are the things that we hope that you'll continue to hold hearings on with regard to this ESG movement.
Thank you very much. I simply call it active government making decisions on behalf of free people, and I agree with you. I want to thank the gentleman from Illinois. I believe that his presence today says volumes about not only what he believes in, but very clearly my colleagues that are my dear friends also viewed you as an advocate to express their ideas as an evaluator, and I want to thank you very much. I yield back my time, and we now would recognize the gentleman from Rhode Island for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chairman and Ranking Member. Thank you for letting me join you today. I asked to join the Oversight Committee today because of my background as a state treasurer for 8 years, where I was a colleague of Treasurer Frericks, and my experience as an investor in the private sector before that. And the message that I want to deliver, because people need to understand it, is that these attacks against ESG investing are based on a fallacy. They are based on the argument that somehow incorporating environmental and social and governance factors is a breach of fiduciary duty to clients or to beneficiaries. That is not true. The opposite is the case. As fiduciaries, we would not be doing our jobs if we did not consider environmental and social and governance risks when making investment decisions. And in fact, investors in companies that have failed to incorporate ESG risks into their decision-making have lost a lot of money as a result. Do you want some examples? BP. After the Deepwater Horizon spill, BP stock dropped 55%, eliminating $88 billion of shareholder value because that company failed to adopt proactive safety protocols. Volkswagen, their emissions scandal caused their stock to drop nearly 30%, also costing investors billions of dollars. We've heard about Norfolk Southern and Purdue Pharma. The list goes on and on. Companies that do not manage their environmental risks, their labor risks, their consumer protection risks appropriately open up investors, including retail investors, pensioners, retirees, to financial losses. So investors would not be doing their jobs if they did not think about these issues when making investment decisions. And in fact, because we have a free market in this country, investors are voting with their feet. We've heard about how big companies like BlackRock and others that integrate ESG factors into their decision-making process control trillions of dollars. Yes, because investors have chosen to take their business there because they want their asset managers to be incorporating all of these factors into their decision-making process. And the data has borne out. Over the last 5 years, according to Morningstar, 2/3 of funds that emphasize ESG in their investment process have ranked in the top half of performance relative to their peers. That's mutual funds. So again, ESG investing, it is common sense, and it's been going on for years as well. Private investors have been doing this for decades. The Department of Labor has been allowing this for public funds for decades. The SEC has allowed proxy voting proposals on ESG issues for decades. What is new here is this trumped-up opposition, no doubt funded by and pushed by the oil and gas industry, that is desperately trying to hang on because they know that the smart capital is moving toward a clean energy future. Again, if you want an example, if you had invested $100 in ExxonMobil stock 5 years ago, that $100 would be worth $142 today. Pretty good. If you had invested that same $100 in First Solar, a publicly traded company, it would be worth $267 today. So the industries of the future are winning, and the industries of the past are now trying to rig the game by employing government interference to prevent investors from doing their jobs. And I would note, this government interference is being run oftentimes by people who have no investment experience themselves at all. The two Republican witnesses who are here, who may be very credentialed in other ways, between the two of them have 0 degrees in investments or economics or finance, are not CPAs, are not chartered financial
I ran a
analysts.
tech venture fund, just so you know, Congressman. So,
Yeah, fair
okay,
enough,
so
but no degrees, no
But just to
CFA,
be clear
no
on the
CPA.
record, I just
Reclaiming
wanted
my
to
time,
know, yeah.
reclaiming my time. All right, I've spent a career in this, as has Treasurer Frericks and many others who were not given the opportunity to come here today. Our Republican witnesses have experience trying to overturn elections that were freely and fairly won, but not incorporating smart ESG factors into investment decisions. So listen, we know what's going on here. This is a taxpayer-funded effort to run interference for the oil and gas industries, prevent investors from doing their jobs and exercising their judgment, and prevent investors from having the options for where to move their money. It's un-American, it's not in keeping with the free market or sound investment principles. And with that, I'm out of time, and I yield back.
Chair recognizes Mr. Burleson from Missouri for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I am an investment advisor representative. I do have a securities license, and I sit across the table from people who, when you manage someone's accounts, and the burden is on you to make sure they make it all the way to end of life, and that their funds do not run dry. And I'll tell you, when you're facing someone and you're looking them across the aisle, you realize that burden. It weighs on you. And when your clients' portfolios go down, you feel the pain. But you know what I would never do? I would never, and I would think it would be fiscally irresponsible to apply my morality on my clients' funds, right? Mr. Marshall, would you not agree that people have different moralities, and if your investor is applying their brand of morality on your funds, would you be pleased with your performance?
I would not, but that's the goal of those that initiated ESG concepts to the UN, which said that they want to transform the world by creating a global energy economy, as well as being able to set preferred societal values.
Yeah, and Mr. Reyes, the problem is that we have a situation where the tail, folks like Mr. Frakes, is wagging the dog, because in using his position in voting position to be able to change the direction of companies, and these companies are where our citizens and their retirements are invested.
That's correct. And I wouldn't want anybody's morality, whether it was progressive, conservative, or something in between, voting with my dollars. And when I and my team invested on behalf of others, it was the same. We wouldn't interject our own political preferences or personal preferences.
Well, and the impact on states is unbelievable. We heard from that Illinois is over 100, I saw reports, $110 billion in a pension deficit. It may be more, right? And so the problem is that in order to make that up, is that the state has to kick in more dollars in order to get that fund to be solvent. That's what happens in every state. When you become below a particular level of solvency for your pension, you start having to kick in more. And the impact on the taxpayers is devastating. So yeah, we can talk about whatever moral decision that you want to make. You can make voting right decisions to direct people's money towards your brand of morality. But when you mess around with other people's money and they get hurt, who pays? Do you? No, you don't pay. They do. And that's what this is about. We're trying to make sure that people are not messing around with retirees' funds. So let me ask this question. It was mentioned that we are not able to, we just want to have more information out there. So let me ask a question. Mr. Marshall, and you guys can go down the line, just say, in Missouri, our treasurer issued a rule that said, if your money manager is using ESG in their metrics, then your client should probably know about that, right? More information would be good information. Would you agree with that?
I don't disagree at all.
Mr. Reyes, do you agree with that?
Agreed.
Do you agree with that, Mr. Frakes? More information is good information?
Mike Furix, I agree with that.
Furix.
And I disclose all this on our website. We are public and transparent.
Okay.
I agree with you. But I would disagree with your statement that this is about me pushing my values. This is about pushing value for companies. When we hold,
Right. And Mr. Franks, businesses are not going to heaven or hell, are they? There's
no, but businesses do declare bankruptcy, like Purdue Pharma.
Well, that was
a bad
math.
investment.
That is math. Math is not more. There's no morality to math. I'll
completely agree with that statement.
But again, I reiterate that as an investment advisor who actually had to deal with clients and actually worry and stress about whether or not, when they're making that decision, I'm retiring, am I going to make it all the way through? And you're sweating that for them, you're stressing about that for them. It's not your money. But when you know them and you're looking them in the eye, you know that you cannot mess around with their money and you apply your morality. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I sweat the 850,000 families who are saving for college education to make sure they can graduate, they can
Point
go
of
to
order.
college without more debt.
There's no question for the gentleman.
Chair recognizes Mr.
He yielded
Oh,
back.
Mr. Biggs, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I've been running back and forth from hearing to hearing today. Always interesting to hear people say things, just make them up. Fantasy, we got to hear from one of our colleagues across the aisle a moment ago saying this hearing is a result of trying to protect oil and gas industry. You know, sometimes you get to fabricate, you get to promote a fantasy, and that's what we just heard. But that's too bad. That's too bad. It's been nearly a decade since this committee under Chairman Issa exposed Operation Checkpoint, the Obama administration's weaponization of regulatory power to starve lawful businesses of their access to capital and banking services. Unfortunately, the latest iteration of Choke Point is being undertaken by unaccountable international organizations, large asset managers acting in breach of their fiduciary responsibilities, and is being encouraged by the Biden administration, which is pushing the advancement of ESG priorities beyond agency authorities and at the expense of their statutory missions. General Reyes and General Marshall, I understand that one of my Democrat colleagues has accused committee Republicans of promoting corporate socialism today, another fabrication and fantasy. Given that ESG is being forced on the public by the Biden administration and by activists, Mr. Reyes, Mr. Marshall, would either of you like to respond to the claim made by one of my colleagues?
I think we're advocating corporate independence, the ability to make decisions for your business based upon what's best in the return for shareholders as a result of the work that you're doing. One of the things that we clearly have seen is a concentration of wealth in a very few that is cause for them to be able to create policy changes within companies that are not generated by their board, not generated by shareholders who generally are involved, but instead by a small group who happens to hold significant amounts of shares in those companies. The other thing, Mr. Congressman, that we've heard today is what is truly a fiduciary duty. It is clear that this is a UN-generated project, ESG factors themselves. That's where it came from. And even the UN acknowledged in a recent report in 2021 that the definition of fiduciary duty needs to be changed in order to validly consider ESG factors. That's not a part of the financial return. It's clearly designed to create a very different political agenda and not one consistent with investor return.
Yeah. So I want to elaborate, since we only have 2.5 minutes left, because what you're talking about, the way I understand, is mixed motive investing. So there's a 2020 Stanford Law Review article by Max Schatzenbach and Robert Sitkoff entitled Reconciling Fiduciary Duty, Social Conscience, the Law and Economics of ESG Investing by Trustee. Are either of you familiar with that piece?
I'm not.
I'm not, sir.
Okay. Well, the article goes on to describe for trustees acting with mixed motive. He says acting with mixed motives triggers an irrebuttable presumption of wrongdoing under the sole interest rule. Does that sound accurate to you as the way you understand the sole interest rule?
Yes.
That's accurate, Congressman.
If so, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to submit to the record several decisions: the Fifth Third versus Dudenhofer case, the Central States versus Central Transport case, and several articles by Vollmer. But I want to go.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. I want to go to this right here. From that Stanford Law Review article, and then I'm going to ask you to expand on this in our closing amount of time. Acting with mixed motives triggers an irrebuttable presumption of wrongdoing, full stop. Because the sole interest rule is prohibitory rather than regulatory, to prove a breach, a beneficiary need only prove the fact of a trustee's mixed motives. Under the sole interest rule, the trustee violates the duty of loyalty, even in the absence of self-dealing, if the trustee has any motive or rationale for undertaking an action other than the sole interest or exclusive benefit of the beneficiary. How does ESG standards encroach upon the fiduciary duty described by the sole interest rule?
Before you came, Congressman, we read numerous quotes from these horizontal organizations that clearly state their ultimate purpose, and there's an end result for net zero compliance. That is the motivation for them beyond anything else, and that's why that is more akin to corporate socialism than anything that we espouse. Socialism takes away liberty, it takes away free will, and socialism doesn't ask what's in the best interest of the individual, it asks what's in the best interest of the state. We're absolutely championing the opposite, which is how do you maximize shareholder value for the individual?
Thank you, and I see that my time has expired, but I wish you, Mr. Reyes, if you'd give your treasurer, State Treasurer Morley Oaks, my
I'll pass on to our great treasurer.
Thank you.
Your hello.
Yield back, thanks.
Gentleman yields back, and that concludes our questioning portion. I'll now yield to the ranking member to deliver a closing statement.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and I want to thank all of our witnesses for what was a truly enlightening and educational discussion, which I would recommend to every U.S. citizen to come check out, and certainly business school students, economics students, law students, students of every type, because this has been a fascinating and important discussion. I don't know that it advanced the campaign against ESG. I think it reaffirmed the basic principles of the free market, and to allow asset managers like the distinguished treasurer of the state of Illinois to do their jobs. Now, Mr. Chairman, I started by showing a graph demonstrating that money invested over the last decade in a large cap ESG influence fund did substantially better than investment in the Standard & Poor 500 Energy Index. And that came not from us, not from the Democratic staff of the House Oversight Committee, it came from Bloomberg News. And I would like to submit the article for the record just so we can clarify that, if that's okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now, that graph, which is quite dramatic, showing that over a decade your money would have been better put in an ESG-defined fund than just the general S&P 500 Energy Index, which I wasn't aware of. But that graph seems to support Mr. Frerichs' basic point today that ESG considerations are totally consistent with an asset manager's fiduciary duties to maximize shareholder value, and arguably compelled by it. That's certainly the interpretation I think that Mr. Frerichs has offered today, that it would be in disregard of your fiduciary duties simply to try to close your eyes to environmental, social, and political concerns. For example, we talked about Norfolk Southern. If it had come to the attention of investors before the derailment, which obviously caused a tanking of the value of the stock, that Norfolk Southern was making a lot of money, but it was cutting corners on safety, and it was laying off workers to save money, but making it more dangerous on the rails, that's something that should be taken into account. I've not heard a single argument from the other side that it shouldn't be taken into account. You could say the exact same thing with Purdue. Mr. Frerichs testified, I was using it as a hypothetical. He said they actually came to Illinois. He faced the question whether or not to invest in Purdue, and Purdue was coming back with staggering profits, but he looked behind the curtain, and he didn't like what he saw in terms of Purdue getting people hooked on OxyContin, oxycodone, and he said, that's not a good long-term investment for the teachers and firefighters and cops of Illinois. And so he avoided it. He was doing his fiduciary duty That's what it means to do your fiduciary duty. It would be, at least arguably, a violation of it to disregard all of those kinds of concerns. I mean, the Massey Energy Company coal company in West Virginia was making tons of money up until the Upper Big Branch mine disaster, which killed 29 miners. If you looked more deeply into it, they had hundreds of violations with OSHA and with the Mine Safety Organization. That's something that asset managers shouldn't take into account. That just seems way off to me. But look, in the final analysis, it's all about free choice. If Illinois wants to look at the mine regulatory safety record of a particular company, I know you don't have mining there, but if you want to look at Purdue's actual record, what they're doing with oxycodone, and Utah doesn't want to look at it, well, that's your choice. You do it. Different states can define the fiduciary duty differently. In Texas, they seem to be defining the fiduciary duty as doing whatever the oil and gas industry wants or the gun industry. Look what they just did in Texas under this whole anti-ESG, anti-woke campaign. They pulled the leash on municipal governments in the state and dramatically interfered in the free market to protect the oil and gas industry and the firearm manufacturers by telling local governments that they could not make contracts with certain private banks, which the legislature deemed to be too woke on those issues if they, took policies or made statements that were considered too woke by the legislature. Okay, well, what was the upshot of this anti-woke legislation in Texas? Well, don't take my word for it. Check out a study by Wharton professor Daniel Garrett and a Fed economist, Ivan Ivanov, which found that this anti-woke sledgehammer in Texas is costing the cities and towns of Texas, meaning the taxpayers of Texas, an additional $305 million to $532 million in additional interest payments every single year. Now look, if Texas wants to spend an extra $500 million on interest payments to make a totally political, totally partisan anti-woke statement, then have at it. That's up to them. At some point, the people of Texas will wake up to it, but that's their choice. But don't interfere with the right of Illinois and all the other states to look at all of the factors that actually influence the valuation of companies. Nobody should think, by the way, that this movement is striking a blow against global elites, which we've heard a lot about today. If you're interested in that, you should join our investigation into Donald Trump and Jared Kushner, who brought home $2 billion, not million, $2 billion from Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates for a company he created the day after the Trump administration ended. So don't talk to me about global elites. That's the Trump family business, trafficking in global elites and their businesses. And he collected millions of dollars in unconstitutional foreign emoluments from Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Indonesia, Egypt, a whole bunch of countries that patronized his hotels and his golf courses. So I don't want to be lectured to by anybody about global elites, because I was here for the 4 years of the Trump administration. Now, my friend the chairman asked the question, well, what would happen in China? Or what would happen in another authoritarian regime with ESG? Do they have ESG? Absolutely not. That's the difference between a free market democratic society and an authoritarian or totalitarian society. All that matters is what the state rulers tell you to do. Well, here the state rulers want to say everybody's got to invest in big oil and big gas, even if they don't think it's the right thing to do from a fiduciary perspective. They want to try to compel people's choices. Why don't we let the free market operate instead? In the final analysis, these decisions are being made not contrary to the gentleman's statements before, not according to morality, but according to economics. That's what we heard from the excellent treasurer of the state of Illinois today. And those are the kinds of decisions that are being made across the country. Now, Americans have the opportunity to say, we don't want to patronize businesses that are supporting China, General Xi, or Putin in Russia, or any authoritarian regime. But when they're managing pension funds, they're not making a moral decision, they're making a financial decision. And if they're withdrawing from that, they're saying it's not a good bet. That's not a good bet for the people. I know the Attorney General of Alabama said, well, you should disregard all moral criteria. I think he was asked about communist China. He was asked about Nazi Germany. He said, just maximize profit. I understand that view. Okay, that's not the view most citizens have. But a lot of the asset managers say it's not a good bet to invest in Marcos in the Philippines or General Xi in China or Orban in Hungary or what have you. But that's up to them. And we shouldn't be interfering in one direction or another. And that's the problem with this whole anti-ESG thing. It is, even though it's dressed up as a critique of political investing, it's all about promoting political investing and promoting a political agenda. But luckily, I think the asset managers see it for what it is, the businesses see it for what it is, and the people see it for what it is. And I don't think it's going anywhere. So it's going to be on to the next battle in the culture war. I yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Now I want to thank our witnesses for being here today. I know it was a long day. To those watching, it may seem that there were two different hearings occurring today. One which explored concerns with asset managers violating their fiduciary duty to their clients by chasing left-wing agendas regarding the environment and social issues, and the other which sought to cover for the actions of asset managers abusing their authority by making broad appeals to the need for data or access to information. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle seem to be conflating the term responsible investing to mean socially responsible investing, as opposed to the fiscal responsibility that is asset managers' legally mandated fiduciary duty to their clients. I think we and asset managers need a reminder: the money asset managers invest is not their own. A fund manager's definition of socially responsible may not only directly oppose their clients' views. Investing to satisfy a money manager's own ESG agenda could tank savings and retirements across the nation. We will continue to investigate liberal agendas pushed throughout the economy and society, be it by the private sector or, more worrisome, by the government. And let's hope these left-wing activists who are pushing this ESG agenda don't continue regulating our banks and setting our energy policy and doing many other jobs that have a detrimental impact on our economy and on society. If the Biden administration is weaponizing a whole-of-government approach to coordinate and force a whole-of-industry compliance with a woke agenda, it is this committee's responsibility to conduct oversight to the American people, and we intend to provide it. With that, again, I thank the witnesses for being here today. I know it was a very long day, and I declare this meeting adjourned.